Hello, my friend. Tonight we wander beneath ancient skies where lonely fires flicker against black mountain ridges and frightened shepherds glance upward through cold midnight air. The wind carries dust across forgotten valleys. Somewhere beyond those hills, strange figures descend in silence. Their shadows move across stone like living storms. Villagers pull wool blankets tighter around trembling shoulders, while distant animals suddenly fall quiet as though the earth itself senses approaching change. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while the fire crackles softly nearby, share your location and local time in the comments below. There is something comforting about knowing listeners across the world drift through these ancient mysteries together tonight. You settle deeper into stillness while the oldest stories begin unfolding around you. They arrive slowly, like smoke through cedar branches. Long before modern maps, before written kingdoms rose beside organized roads, people already feared the heavens above them. Ancient communities watched stars with deep attention because the sky seemed alive with intention. Storms arrived without warning. Comets streaked across darkness like divine messages. Eclipses transformed daylight into panic. Every strange movement overhead invited meaning. Then came stories about watchers, not ordinary travelers, not kings, something older. According to ancient traditions preserved across generations, these beings descended from the heavens and entered the human world directly. Some accounts describe them as guardians assigned to observe humanity. Others portray them as rebellious figures crossing boundaries never meant to be crossed. Their arrival changed everything. For a moment, it feels as though you stand beside those early witnesses yourself. You hear sandals scraping rough stone paths. You smell wood smoke drifting from cooking fires, mixed with damp wool and mountain rain. Somewhere nearby, a child cries softly while adults whisper sitting nervously outside small clay homes. The Watchers are coming. Records preserved by scholars connected with the University of Oxford note that many ancient civilizations shared remarkably similar traditions about divine beings interacting with humanity. Historians continue studying why these stories appear across distant cultures separated by geography and language. Some researchers believe such tales reflected shared fears surrounding authority and nature. Others suspect they preserved fragments of much older oral traditions stretching beyond recorded history. No agreement has been reached on whether these similarities emerged independently or spread through cultural exchange across ancient trade networks. You can almost imagine exhausted travelers carrying these stories from settlement to settlement beneath harsh desert moons. One village adds details, another removes them. Fear reshapes memory. Memory reshapes fear. Soon the Watchers become more than rumors. Ancient storytellers describe them descending upon remote mountains where clouds wrapped stone peaks like heavy curtains. The imagery feels strangely cinematic even today. Towering figures emerge from darkness while thunder rolls overhead. Human witnesses freeze in place. Nobody speaks. A curious footnote appears in several traditions surrounding these beings. They are not always described as monstrous at first. Some accounts portray them as beautiful, wise, even radiant. They teach forbidden knowledge. They reveal secrets hidden from ordinary humanity. Metalworking improves. Warfare evolves. Astronomy expands. Cosmetics appear. Strange medicines spread through settlements. Knowledge changes civilization quickly. Too quickly, perhaps. You walk slowly through this growing ancient world while unease thickens around every lesson the Watchers provide. Farmers once focused on seasons and rivers. Now people learn techniques connected with ambition, conquest, and power. Tribal conflicts become bloodier. Pride grows sharper. Leaders seek dominance instead of survival. The stories always darken here. Ancient listeners likely understood the warning immediately. Knowledge itself was never entirely safe. Every gift carried consequence. You can almost hear older villagers muttering beside nighttime fires about boundaries humans were never meant to cross. One scandalous aside hidden within later traditions claims people became obsessed with appearance after learning heavenly secrets. Mirrors multiplied, jewelry grew elaborate, vanity flourished beside violence. Human society drifted toward excess while ordinary labourers struggled beneath expanding ambitions, and above them stood the children, the Nephilim. Even now, the word feels heavy inside quiet darkness. Most traditions describe these beings as giants born from unions between the Watchers and human women. Their size varies depending upon the storyteller. Some portray them merely taller than ordinary people. Others describe impossible heights reaching beyond reason itself. Ancient exaggeration certainly shaped these accounts over centuries, yet the emotional effect remained consistent. The Nephilim inspired awe and dread. Your mind drifts through crowded settlements where whispers spread before dawn. Someone saw enormous footprints near riverbanks. Hunters discovered shattered animal carcasses deep within cedar forests. Travellers vanished along mountain passes. Children pointed toward distant silhouettes moving against sunrise mist. Fear travels quickly in small communities. Research discussed by historians connected with Harvard University suggests giant myths often emerged within societies confronting warfare, famine, or political instability. Oversized enemies symbolized overwhelming threats beyond normal human control. Yet scholars also acknowledge that ancient discoveries of massive fossil bones likely influenced many traditions about giants. Imagine uncovering mammoth remains without scientific understanding. The explanation would feel obvious. Giants once walked here. Arguments still split among researchers concerning whether ancient people interpreted fossil discoveries as evidence supporting older supernatural traditions, or whether fossils inspired entirely new giant myths altogether. You continue onward through the ancient landscape while tension quietly builds beneath every conversation. The Watchers promised advancement, yet communities now feel unstable. Violence increases, tribal rivalries intensify. Greed spreads through marketplaces once governed by simpler customs. The old balance fades. In your ears, the echo changes into distant hammering from primitive forges. Sparks rise into darkness. Men shape bronze blades with newly learned techniques while local leaders dream about expansion. Nearby women trade whispered fears beside water wells. Children glance nervously toward surrounding hills. Everybody senses approaching disaster. Ancient flood traditions soon become deeply connected with these stories. Corruption grows unbearable. Humanity loses direction. The earth itself seems exhausted by endless conflict. In many versions, the existence of the Nephilim represents the clearest sign that sacred boundaries between heaven and humanity have shattered completely. The world cannot continue unchanged. Oddly enough, even modern audiences remain fascinated by these ancient warnings. Perhaps giant stories speak to permanent human anxieties about forbidden knowledge and uncontrolled power. Every generation fears creating forces beyond its understanding. Ancient listeners worried about heavenly beings teaching dangerous secrets. Modern societies worry about technologies spreading faster than wisdom. The emotional pattern remains surprisingly familiar. Night deepens around you now. Firelight softens against stone walls while distant winds move gently across sleeping valleys. Somewhere high above, stars continue their silent turning, exactly as they did thousands of years ago, when frightened shepherds first imagined watchers descending from the heavens. You breathe slowly. The ancient world waits ahead, and the giants are only beginning to rise. The fire beside you burns lower now, releasing thin ribbons of smoke that drift toward a sky crowded with stars. Somewhere beyond the nearest hills, dogs bark uneasily before falling silent again. Villagers pull rough cloaks closer against the night wind. Nobody wants to wander alone after sunset anymore. The stories have changed the atmosphere of ordinary life. At first, rumours about the strange children spread slowly between settlements. Travellers described oversized infants born with unusual strength and unsettling eyes. Midwives whispered about impossible growth rates. Farmers swore they saw enormous footprints beside riverbanks after heavy rain. Most listeners dismissed these tales beside evening meals. Every generation invents frightening legends. Then the children kept growing. For a moment, it feels as though you stand inside one of those nervous communities yourself. You hear goats shifting inside wooden pens. You smell crushed herbs hanging from ceiling beams. Nearby anxious parents pull sleeping children indoors before darkness fully settles across the valley floor. Something unnatural walks these lands now. Ancient storytellers rarely describe the Nephilim with simple language. Their presence overwhelms ordinary categories. Some traditions portray them as warriors possessing unmatched strength. Others emphasize their hunger pride and uncontrollable violence. Even when details differ, the emotional tone remains consistent. Humanity feels suddenly smaller beneath them, and deeply vulnerable. Records examined by researchers connected with Yale University suggest giant figures in ancient mythology often represented social fears surrounding powerful ruling classes or invading armies. When communities faced overwhelming military threats, stories transformed human enemies into towering symbolic monsters. Yet certain historians caution against reducing every ancient account into pure metaphor. Oral traditions, they argue, frequently preserve emotional truths even after factual details become distorted through centuries of retelling. Scholars still debate whether the Nephilim traditions emerged primarily from historical memory symbolic storytelling or layered combinations of both. You continue walking through this uneasy ancient world while tension gathers around every marketplace conversation. Merchants arriving from distant regions now carry similar reports. Entire villages abandoned. Livestock disappearing overnight. Strange warriors demanding tribute from weaker settlements. The giants are no longer distant rumours. A curious footnote preserved within several traditions claims the Nephilim possessed enormous appetites that strained surrounding communities. Grain stores emptied quickly. Hunting grounds became barren. Smaller tribes struggled to survive beside beings consuming resources at impossible rates. Whether literal or symbolic, the message feels clear enough. Power devours. Your mind drifts across rough mountain terrain, where frightened shepherds gather beside small fires, the speaking quietly beneath cold winds. One man claims he saw towering figures crossing a ridge at dawn. Another swears enormous weapons glimmered beneath moonlight near the forest edge. Nobody laughs anymore. Fear has matured into expectation. In your ears, the sound changes into heavy footsteps echoing through narrow stone streets. Imagine standing near a crowded market while strangers suddenly part in alarm. The sunlight disappears behind an enormous silhouette. Dust swirls around sandaled feet far larger than ordinary human proportions. Children freeze beside clay walls. Traders lower their eyes immediately. No one knew wants attention from such beings. One scandalous aside found in later retellings suggests some local rulers admired the Nephilim, despite widespread fear. Strength attracts loyalty almost as quickly as terror does. Smaller kings supposedly formed alliances with giant clans, hoping borrowed power would protect their territories from rivals. Ancient politics rarely leave morality untouched for long. You notice how human behavior shifts around overwhelming force. Communities become divided. Some resist, others cooperate. A few attempt worship. Nothing changes across history quite so reliably. Research discussed by scholars associated with Princeton University notes that many ancient societies connected physical size with divine favor and leadership authority. Monumental statues, oversized royal imagery, and exaggerated heroic descriptions reinforced political control by making rulers appear larger than ordinary humanity. The Nephilim legends may have amplified this instinct into supernatural dimensions. Still, no agreement exists regarding how much these traditions reflected actual cultural memories versus purely symbolic imagination. The uncertainty itself becomes part of the mystery. You walk onward beneath dim torchlight while stories surrounding the Watchers continue evolving. Some accounts now portray them less as wise teachers and more as corrupting influences unable to control their own offspring. Forbidden knowledge spreads alongside violence. Weapon crafting improves further. Tribal warfare grows increasingly brutal. Human ambition expands beyond previous limits. The old world feels unstable beneath your feet. Oddly enough, ancient listeners probably recognize familiar patterns within these tales immediately. Societies often experience rapid technological change alongside rising conflict. New tools create new temptations. Improved weapons encourage conquest. Expanding knowledge destabilizes older customs. The Watchers simply dramatized anxieties every civilization eventually confronts. And above all stood the giants. For a moment you smell rain striking dry earth while thunder rolls beyond distant hills. Villagers gather inside cramped homes as elders recite warnings beside flickering oil lamps. They speak about boundaries separating heaven from humanity. They speak about pride growing too powerful. They speak about violence poisoning the land itself. Outside, darkness deepens. Ancient flood narratives begin whispering through these traditions long before waters actually arrive. Nature grows restless. Seasons become unpredictable. Crops fail unexpectedly. Animals behave strangely. Many storytellers describe the world itself reacting against spreading corruption associated with the Watchers and their children. The earth grows tired. A mainstream historical observation discussed within research from the University of Chicago highlights how flood myths appear across numerous ancient civilizations surrounding major river systems. Seasonal flooding shaped daily survival, making catastrophic water disasters both familiar and terrifying. Over generations, memories of real floods likely merged with moral storytelling, traditions about divine punishment and social collapse. Arguments continue among historians regarding whether certain ancient flood accounts preserve memories of specific regional disasters or function mainly as symbolic narratives about human failure. You continue moving through narrow valleys where tension lingers like smoke trapped beneath low ceilings. Somewhere nearby, mothers hush frightened children, while exhausted farmers sharpen crude tools beside dying fires. Nobody sleeps easily anymore. Every sound beyond village walls invites suspicion. The Nephilim dominate imagination itself, and perhaps that matters most. Because giant legends are never merely about size, they reflect humanity confronting forces that feel overwhelming, uncontrollable, and morally dangerous. Ancient listeners saw their fears embodied within towering figures roaming across fragile landscapes. Modern audiences still recognize the emotional shape immediately. You know that feeling too. The sensation that something larger than ordinary life has entered the world and shifted its balance permanently. Night air cools against your skin now while stars burn quietly overhead. The ancient valleys remain restless beneath them. Somewhere in darkness, enormous shadows continue moving beyond the edges of firelight. The children of the Watchers are growing stronger, and the world edges closer toward catastrophe with every passing season. The valleys feel heavier now. Even the air seems burdened by expectation. Smoke rises from distant settlements in thin grey lines while clouds gather across darkening mountains. Rivers move sluggishly beneath fading sunlight. Animals grow restless before storms arrive. Ancient people notice such things immediately. The world no longer feels stable. You walk beside weary travellers following narrow dirt paths between scattered villages. Their sandals scrape against loose stone. Leather water skins sway softly with every step. Nobody speaks much after sunset anymore. Too many frightening stories travel through darkness. Some settlements already stand abandoned. Your mind drifts toward one silent farming village where cooking fires have long since died. Broken baskets remain scattered beside empty homes. Grain jars sit untouched beneath collapsed roofs. Wind pushes dust through open doorways while crows circle overhead in uneasy silence. Whatever happened here frightened survivors deeply enough to leave everything behind. Ancient traditions increasingly describe the earth before the flood as violent, prideful, and morally exhausted. The Watchers brought forbidden knowledge. Their children magnified conflict further. Human rulers embraced greed. Warfare spread across fertile valleys once governed by older customs and seasonal rhythms. The balance shattered slowly. Then all at once, records examined by scholars connected with Stanford University suggest many ancient moral narratives followed a recognizable pattern. Societies experiencing rapid political change often created stories warning against uncontrolled ambition and declining social order. These narratives frame disasters not as random events, but as consequences emerging from collective human behavior. Still, historians remain divided over whether traditions surrounding the Nephilim reflected specific historical crises remembered through mythic storytelling, or broader symbolic anxieties about civilization itself. You continue onward while thunder mutters faintly beyond distant ridges. Farmers glance nervously toward darkening skies. The weather has become unpredictable. Long droughts suddenly break into devastating storms. Crops fail without a warning. Rivers overflow at strange times. In ancient communities dependent upon fragile agricultural cycle, environmental instability feels terrifying. The earth itself seems angry. For a moment, it feels as though you sit beside exhausted elders gathered around a dim oil lamp. Their faces flicker gold against mud brick walls. One old woman speaks quietly about signs appearing in dreams. Another remembers unusual stars crossing the heavens weeks earlier. A shepherd swears entire flocks panicked beneath clear skies for no visible reason. Nobody dismisses omens now. A curious footnote preserved within certain ancient traditions claims the Nephilim themselves became increasingly destructive as conditions worsened. Some accounts portray them fighting among one another for territory and resources. Others describe enormous violence directed toward ordinary human communities caught helplessly between competing powers. Strength without restraint rarely ends peacefully. You hear distant hammering from fortified settlements preparing for conflict. Wooden gates rise higher. Watchtowers multiply near trade routes. Tribal leaders recruit additional fighters despite shrinking food supplies. Fear transforms societies quickly. Every stranger becomes suspicious. Every rumor feels possible. And above all hangs the threat of coming judgment. One scandalous aside hidden within later interpretations suggests people ignored warnings for generations because prosperity initially accompanied the Watcher's arrival. Knowledge improved farming techniques. Metal tools increased efficiency. Wealth expanded for powerful families. Ancient listeners likely understood this uncomfortable truth immediately. Danger often arrives disguised as advancement. Research discussed in publications associated with Harvard University notes that civilizations frequently struggle recognizing long-term consequences during periods of technological or economic growth. Early benefits overshadow emerging instability. Only later do societies fully confront the costs attached to rapid transformation. Scholars continue debating whether ancient flood narratives symbolized environmental collapse, political upheaval, spiritual corruption, or combinations of all three layered together through oral tradition. Perhaps the stories endure because they touch several fears simultaneously. Your mind drifts across crowded marketplaces where tension now infects ordinary conversations. Merchants argue over shrinking grain supplies. Soldiers patrol more aggressively. Children stare silently towards surrounding hills. Nearby priests offer sacrifices beneath heavy clouds, while incense smoke curls through damp evening air. Something approaches. In your ears, rain begins tapping softly against stone rooftops. At first the sound feels calming, gentle, familiar. Then the downpour strengthens unexpectedly. Gutters overflow. Narrow streets become rivers of mud. Villagers rush indoors carrying baskets and frightened animals while thunder shakes the surrounding mountains. Ancient people lived close to nature's moods. Storms possessed emotional weight modern cities rarely experience. Floodwaters could erase entire communities overnight. Crops disappeared beneath rising rivers. Disease followed standing water. Survival depended upon fragile environmental balance. When that balance failed, terror spread quickly. Oddly enough, many ancient flood traditions include survivors receiving warnings beforehand. Sometimes dreams reveal danger, sometimes divine messengers appear, sometimes isolated righteous figures notice corruption, others ignore completely. These narrative patterns likely comforted listeners confronting unpredictable disasters. The idea that wisdom and preparation might preserve life offered emotional reassurance against overwhelming uncertainty. No agreement has been reached among historians regarding whether such stories preserve memories of real individuals surviving regional catastrophes or function primarily as moral teaching devices shaped through centuries of retelling. You continue walking through deepening rain while distant lightning illuminates mountain peaks in pale silver flashes. Villagers huddle inside crowded shelters listening to winds howl beyond wooden doors. Somewhere outside, rivers already rise beyond their banks. The world feels fragile tonight. A mainstream historical observation discussed by researchers connected with Columbia University emphasizes how oral storytelling helped ancient societies process collective trauma after disasters. Floods, invasions, famine, and disease became woven into narratives, explaining why suffering occurred and how communities might avoid repeating destructive patterns in the future. Stories preserve survival, not merely entertainment. You notice how the Nephilim traditions increasingly frame giant figures as symptoms of deeper imbalance, rather than isolated monsters alone. The true danger involves broken boundaries, uncontrolled ambition, violence, spreading faster than wisdom, and humanity losing connection with older forms of restraint. The giants simply make invisible fears visible. For a moment, the storm outside softens slightly. Rainwater drips steadily from roof edges, while exhausted families attempt sleep beside dim embers. A child asks whether the watchers still roam the mountains beyond the valley. No adult answers immediately. Some questions feel safer unanswered. You breathe slowly while darkness settles deeper across the ancient landscape. Floodwaters continue gathering beyond unseen hills. Rivers swell beneath relentless rain. Somewhere into distant valleys, frightened communities already flee rising currents beneath skies that refuse to clear, and the old world edges toward its final night. Rain continues falling across the ancient world long after exhausted villagers lose track of days. Rivers swallow roads first, then fields. Then entire settlements vanish beneath churning brown water. Wooden fences drift away like scattered twigs. Livestock cry through storm winds before disappearing into darkness. The familiar shape of civilization dissolves slowly beneath endless rain. You move through this flooded landscape beside survivors carrying little beyond memory itself. The old stories claim the giants vanished within the catastrophe, swept away alongside corrupt kingdoms and violent rulers. Whether ancient listeners understood the flood literally symbolically, or somewhere between those extremes, the emotional meaning remained unmistakable. The world before the waters had become unbearable. Now humanity begins again. For a moment it feels as though you stand upon wet shoreline mud after the storms finally weaken. The air smells raw and cold. Broken tree trunks lie tangled beside receding waters. Survivors stare silently across ruined valleys where homes once stood. Nobody knows what kind of future remains possible. Only silence answers them. Records examined by historians associated with the University of Cambridge note that flood narratives often mark symbolic dividing lines between destroyed ages and renewed civilizations. Ancient societies repeatedly used catastrophic water imagery to describe endings followed by fragile rebirth. The flood becomes both punishment and cleansing, terrifying yet strangely hopeful. Still, scholars continue arguing over whether widespread flood traditions emerged from separate local disasters, remembered independently, or spread outward from shared ancient storytelling roots. You walk onward beside scattered survivor communities rebuilding life carefully from fragments. People salvage tools from mud. They gather seeds preserved inside sealed jars. Temporary shelters rise beside shrinking shorelines. Children born after the catastrophe hear stories about the world before the flood with equal fascination and disbelief. The giants already feel half legendary, yet memory refuses to disappear completely. Your mind drifts through cold evening camps where elders sit beside small fires recounting fearful tales from earlier generations. They speak about enormous warriors roaming distant valleys. They describe heavenly beings teaching forbidden arts. Younger listeners lean closer toward the flames, uncertain whether these stories describe history or nightmare. Perhaps both. One curious footnote preserved within several traditions suggests survivors interpreted unusual ruins after the flood as evidence supporting older giant legends. Massive stone foundations, abandoned fortresses, and weathered monuments seemed impossible for ordinary people to construct. Without modern archaeology, mysterious structures naturally encourage supernatural explanations. Ancient ruins create powerful imagination. Research discussed by scholars connected with the University of Chicago notes that many civilizations attributed forgotten architecture to giants or divine beings, once original builders faded from collective memory. Monumental structures inspired awe precisely because later populations lacked knowledge explaining their construction methods. No agreement has been reached among historians regarding how strongly such discoveries influenced evolving Nephilim traditions after major societal collapses. You continue traveling through recovering landscapes where nature slowly reclaims flooded territories. Marsh grass spreads across abandoned roads. Birds return cautiously to riverbanks. Survivors establish new farming settlements upon higher ground, hoping future generations might avoid repeating old mistakes. Still fear lingers beneath rebuilding efforts. In your ears, the sound changes into rough wooden wheels creaking through muddy terrain, while caravans move carefully between newborn communities. Traders now carry more than grain or tools. They carry stories. Every journey spreads fragments of older memories farther across emerging civilizations. The giants become traveling legends. One scandalous aside appearing in later interpretations claims certain surviving families secretly believe traces of giant bloodlines endured after the flood. Some unusually tall warriors or powerful rulers supposedly descended from remnants hidden beyond known territories, whether symbolic boasting or sincere belief. These rumours added fresh tension to rebuilding societies already haunted by catastrophe. People rarely release frightening ideas completely. For a moment you smell damp earth warming beneath weak sunlight while farmers guide primitive ploughs across softened fields. Children laugh nearby for perhaps the first time in many difficult seasons. Yet even peaceful moments feel fragile. Storm clouds still trigger anxiety. Rising rivers still inspire immediate caution. Trauma reshapes entire cultures. A mainstream historical observation discussed in research associated with Yale University highlights how disaster survivors often preserve collective memory through ritual storytelling. Oral traditions surrounding floods, famines, and invasions helped later generations remember dangers threatening communal survival. Ancient narratives about the Nephilim likely carried similar warning functions long after literal belief varied between communities. The emotional lesson mattered deeply. Boundaries exist for reasons. Oddly enough, rebuilding societies frequently become more spiritually attentive after catastrophe. Survivors seek meaning inside destruction. Priests gain influence. Rituals multiply, moral codes strengthen. Ancient listeners likely understood the flood narratives not merely as historical explanation, but as guidance for avoiding future collapse. Humanity receives another chance. Whether it deserves one remains uncertain. You walk beside growing settlements where leaders attempt at establishing order within unpredictable landscapes. Laws emerge slowly. Trade networks reopen carefully. Families once scattered by disaster reconnect across long distances. Yet beneath ordinary rebuilding efforts, stories about the Watchers continue circulating quietly around nighttime fires. Nobody He forgets the old world. Arguments among modern historians split along fascinating lines here. Some researchers connected with Princeton University believe flood narratives preserved cultural memories from severe climate disruptions affecting early agricultural societies. Others argue these stories evolved primarily as moral allegories, explaining why civilizations rise and fall. A few scholars suggest ancient giant traditions reflected psychological responses to collective trauma itself. Each interpretation reveals something meaningful. None remove the mystery entirely. Your mind drifts toward lonely shepherds once again guiding flocks across high mountain passes beneath fading twilight. They hear strange echoes between cliffs. Sometimes they discover enormous bones emerging from eroded hillsides after heavy rain. Mammoth remains, fossilized creatures, ancient evidence misunderstood through the language available at the time. Giants sleep beneath the earth. At least that is what people begin telling one another. Night settles softly across recovering valleys now. Cooking fires glow warmly beside newly built homes. Somewhere nearby, an old storyteller pauses dramatically, while children listen wide-eyed beneath wool blankets. Outside, stars return clearly for the first time since the great storms ended. The heavens seem quieter tonight, yet the memory of the Watchers remains alive inside human imagination, waiting patiently to rise again when an ever-fear ambition or mystery reshape the world once more. The rebuilt world grows steadily busier beneath widening skies. Villages become towns. Towns become fortified cities wrapped in thick mud brick walls. Traders guide donkey caravans across dusty roads carrying grain, copper, incense, and stories from distant lands. Smoke rises from crowded workshops where metal workers hammer glowing bronze beneath showers of sparks. Humanity rebuilds quickly after disaster, perhaps too quickly. You walk through noisy marketplaces alive with bargaining voices and clattering wheels while priests chant prayers from temple stairways above the crowds. Children weave between merchants selling woven cloth and dried figs. Nearby soldiers stand guard beside palace gates, bronze spears catching sunlight sharply enough to sting the eyes. Power has returned to the earth, and rulers everywhere seek ways to justify it. Ancient kings understood something timeless about human psychology. Strength alone rarely secures loyalty forever. People obey more willingly when power appears sacred, ancient, or touched by heaven itself. This realization reshapes the old stories about giants dramatically. The Nephilim become ancestral symbols. For a moment it feels as though you stand inside a royal court scented with cedar oil and warm wax smoke. Musicians play softly while servants pour dark wine into carved cups. At the far end of the chamber, a king sits elevated above gathered nobles, wrapped in embroidered robes heavy with gold thread. Behind him tower enormous stone statues. Their faces appear almost human, almost. Records examined by researchers connected with Columbia University note that many ancient rulers claimed descent from divine beings or legendary heroes to strengthen political legitimacy. Royal bloodlines frequently blended mythology with history, creating powerful narratives linking kingship directly to heavenly authority. Some historians argue giant ancestry traditions functioned similarly, transforming rulers into symbolic descendants of extraordinary beings standing above ordinary humanity. You continue moving through this expanding ancient world while giant legends attach themselves to dynasties hungry for prestige. Certain warrior kings boast about ancestors possessing impossible strength. Palace inscriptions exaggerate victories until rulers seem almost superhuman. Court poets describe royal bodies as taller, stronger, and brighter than common men. Exaggeration becomes governance. One curious footnote preserved within ancient traditions claims some rulers equal to non-rulers deliberately displayed oversized weapons or armor inside ceremonial halls to reinforce stories about giant forefathers. Imagine entering a throne room where enormous spears line stone walls beside shields too heavy for ordinary soldiers. Visitors would immediately understand the intended message. This king descends from mighty blood. Research discussed by scholars associated with Stanford University suggests monumental architecture and exaggerated royal imagery played crucial psychological roles within early states. Oversized statues, giant thrones, and elevated platforms physically reinforce social hierarchy by making rulers appear larger than life itself. No agreement exists among historians regarding whether certain ancient giant traditions emerged partly from these political performances or developed separately through older mythic storytelling. Perhaps both influences intertwine naturally. Your mind drifts through crowded temple complexes where priests preserve sacred records beside flickering oil lamps. Scribes dip reed pens carefully into black ink while copying stories onto clay tablets and treated skins. Some texts describe heavenly beings descending long ago. Others warn about pride destroying civilizations before the Great Flood. The memories remain alive. In your ears, sandals scrape polished stone floors, while nervous petitioners approach royal courts carrying taxes, disputes, and offerings. Above them loom carved reliefs showing kings defeating enormous enemies or standing beside towering divine figures. Ancient propaganda rarely lacked imagination. Oddly enough, ordinary citizens may have accepted these stories more comfortably than modern audiences expect. The ancient world already felt mysterious and dangerous. Massive storms appeared without warning. Earthquakes shattered cities suddenly. Strange bones emerged from hillsides. Disease spread invisibly. Why would giant ancestors seem impossible? Reality itself felt unpredictable. A mainstream historical observation discussed in research connected with Harvard University highlights how oral traditions often preserved communal identity during periods of rapid urban growth. As early cities expanded, shared myths helped diverse populations maintain cultural cohesion. Giant legends offered rulers and priests emotionally powerful stories linking present societies with legendary ancient pasts. The stories unified people, even through fear. One scandalous aside appearing in later retellings suggests rival kingdoms competed over claims connected with giant ancestry. One ruler boasted taller forefathers, another claimed divine warriors once defended his city directly. Ambition transformed mythology into political competition. Human nature changes very little across centuries. You continue walking beneath enormous city walls, casting cool afternoon shadows across crowded streets. Traders arriving from distant regions now bring foreign variations of giant traditions. Some describe mountain-dwelling clans possessing unusual size. Others speak about ancient warrior races destroyed by heavenly punishment long ago. The legends evolve through travel. Arguments among modern historians remain lively here. Researchers connected with the University of California propose that stories about giant rulers may preserve distorted memories of powerful elite classes physically better nourished than ordinary populations. Taller bodies naturally encourage perceptions of superiority within malnourished societies. Meanwhile, other scholars insist symbolic interpretation explains these traditions more convincingly than biological speculation ever could. The debate continues quietly through lecture halls even now. For a moment you smell incense drifting through temple courtyards, while evening prayers echo softly against stone columns. Worshippers kneel beneath towering statues illuminated by wavering torchlight. Above them painted ceilings depict stars, heavenly beings, and ancient battles between order and chaos. The heavens remain deeply connected with earthly authority. You notice how stories surrounding the Watchers gradually become more complicated over generations. Some traditions portray them entirely as corrupting forces. Others remember them with uneasy admiration because they introduced knowledge humanity continued using afterward. Metalworking, astronomy, architecture, medicine. Civilization itself carries traces of forbidden gifts. That contradiction unsettles people. The giants embody similar tension. They represent violence and excess, yet also greatness, strength, and lost grandeur. Ancient listeners likely felt both fear and fascination simultaneously. Modern audiences still do. Perhaps that emotional conflict explains why these legends survive so long. Night settles gently across the growing cities now. Palace windows glow warmly against deep blue darkness, while distant musicians continue playing beside royal banquets. Somewhere nearby, an elderly storyteller describes mighty ancestors who once walked the earth with impossible power. Children listen breathlessly. Outside the city walls, winds move softly through abandoned ruins older than memory itself. Broken stones wait beneath moonlight while the ancient stories continue spreading from kingdom to kingdom, shaping rulers, priests, and dreamers alike. The Age of Giants has ended, but their shadow now stretches across history itself. Beyond the growing cities, the wilderness still rules enormous stretches of the earth. Deserts shimmer beneath harsh sunlight. Jagged mountains divide kingdoms from one another. Lonely caravan routes twist across empty valleys where wind erases footprints within hours. Travellers crossing these places carry more than supplies. They carry fear. You move beside a small desert caravan, travelling carefully through rocky terrain beneath pale dawn light. Camels groan softly under heavy loads while guards scan distant ridges with tired eyes. The smell of dust clings to everything. Even water tastes warm before midday arrives. Nobody relaxes out here. The stories about giant clans have followed humanity beyond the flood, beyond rebuilding, beyond the rise of kings. Now the legends drift through wilderness regions where borders remain uncertain and maps barely exist. Traders speak about enormous warriors occupying fortified hills. Shepherds whisper about towering raiders appearing during sandstorms. Entire tribes supposedly vanish after wandering too close to the forbidden valleys. The old fears have adapted to a harsher world. For a moment it feels as though you rest beside a flickering campfire while caravan guards exchange uneasy stories before sleep. One man claims he saw a giant lifting stones no ordinary human could move. Another swears distant drums echoed through canyon walls all night without visible musicians nearby. Nobody mocks the tales openly. Research discussed by historians connected with Princeton University notes that ancient desert cultures often developed exaggerated stories about hostile neighboring tribes living beyond settled territory. Isolation and environmental danger encouraged myth-making. Unknown peoples became larger, stronger, and more frightening through repeated retelling. Still, some scholars argue these accounts may preserve distorted memories of unusually tall warrior populations encountered along ancient migration routes. No clear agreement exists. You continue through narrow mountain passes where cold winds whistle across broken cliffs. Travellers grow quieter here. The landscape itself feels watchful. Strange rock formations resemble enormous figures standing against the horizon at sunset. Shadows stretch unnaturally long through fading light. Imagination thrives in lonely places. One curious footnote appearing within several ancient traditions describes desert tribes carrying charms or protective symbols specifically meant to guard against giant enemies. Whether literal defense or psychological comfort, these objects reveal how deeply such stories influenced ordinary daily life. Fear becomes ritual surprisingly quickly. In your ears, the sound changes into leather sandals crunching over gravel, while scouts move ahead searching for safe water sources. Every distant silhouette invites suspicion. A large boulder becomes a crouching figure. A twisted tree resembles raised arms. Exhaustion sharpens ancient anxieties beneath endless skies. The wilderness magnifies every A mainstream historical observation discussed within research connected with Yale University highlights how oral traditions frequently intensified around frontier regions where settled civilizations encountered unfamiliar landscapes and cultures. Deserts, mountains, and forests became ideal settings for legends involving monsters, giants, or supernatural beings because these areas already symbolized uncertainty and danger. The Nephilim traditions fit naturally into such environments. Your mind drifts toward isolated hilltop settlements surrounded by crude defensive walls. Smoke rises from cooking fires while armed lookouts watch nearby valleys constantly. These communities survive through caution. Children learn early which roads to avoid after dark. Elders memorize every reliable spring hidden among the rocks. Life remains fragile here. One scandalous aside preserved within later interpretations claims certain desert warlords intentionally encourage giant rumors surrounding their strongest fighters. Intimidation often proves more effective than actual violence. If enemies believe enormous warriors guard a territory, fewer attacks occur in the first place. Politics and mythology blend easily. You walk onward beneath burning afternoon heat while distant vultures circle high above barren ridges. Caravan leaders discuss recent raids in nervous voices. Some blame ordinary bandits. Others insist something stranger roams these routes now. Ancient people rarely separated practical danger from supernatural possibility completely. Why would they? Without modern communication, the unknown expanded endlessly beyond familiar horizons. Records examined by scholars associated with the University of Chicago suggest stories about giant enemies frequently appeared during periods of migration and territorial conflict in the ancient Near East. Competing tribes described one another using exaggerated physical imagery that reinforced group identity and justified warfare. Yet historians continued debating whether certain traditions surrounding oversized desert warriors reflected purely symbolic descriptions or occasional encounters with unusually imposing populations remembered through mythic language. The line between history and legend blurs constantly out here. For a moment you smell roasted barley and bitter herbs drifting from a roadside camp while twilight cools the desert air. Nearby travelers gather closer together as darkness spreads across empty land. Someone quietly mentions ancient stories about watchers descending upon mountain peaks beyond the horizon. The older legends never disappear entirely. Oddly enough, giant traditions often become more believable during difficult journeys. Fatigue alters perception. Heat distorts distance. Fear sharpens imagination. A tall stranger glimpsed briefly through dust storms can grow monstrous by morning retelling. Human memory reshapes experience naturally. Still, some accounts remain unsettlingly consistent across distant regions. Enormous fortified settlements. Massive weapons displayed as trophies. Bones discovered within caves and burial mounds. Ancient listeners encountered enough unexplained evidence to keep giant stories alive generation after generation. Arguments among modern scholars remain divided along familiar lines. Researchers connected with Stanford University emphasize psychological and cultural explanations behind giant myths, while others remain interested in environmental factors, fossil discoveries, and historical exaggeration surrounding powerful warrior groups. The mystery survives, partly because certainty never fully arrives. Night deepens around the caravan now. Stars appear sharp enough to cut through darkness itself. Camels settle beside low fires, while guards maintain quiet watch beyond the camp. Somewhere far across the desert, thunder rolls faintly through unseen mountains. You lie back beneath the endless sky and understand why ancient travelers believed enormous beings still wandered beyond civilization's edges. The world remains vast, dangerous, poorly understood, and in such places giant shadows continue finding room to walk. Morning arrives pale and dusty across the wilderness routes. Caravan bells ring softly while travelers prepare for another difficult journey between scattered settlements. The desert wind carries fine sand into every fold of cloth and every tired eye. Yet today the stories feel different, more tangible somehow. You follow a narrow trail leading toward abandoned ruins half buried beneath drifting earth. Broken walls writhe from the landscape like cracked teeth. Ancient stairways descend into darkness choked with collapsed stone. Nobody remembers exactly who built this place. That uncertainty alone makes people nervous. Forgotten cities attract dangerous imaginations. For a moment, it feels as though you stand beside cautious explorers holding oil lamps near a ruined gateway. Cool air escapes from underground chambers carrying the scent of damp soil and old dust. Somewhere inside, water drips steadily through unseen tunnels. The silence feels ancient. Stories surrounding giant bones begin multiplying during periods like this when expanding civilizations rediscover remnants from older worlds they barely understand. Farmers uncover oversized skeletons while digging irrigation channels. Shepherds find enormous skulls exposed after heavy rain erodes hillsides. Miners stumble across massive fossil remains buried deep underground. Without modern science, the conclusion feels obvious. Giants once lived here. Records examined by scholars connected with Harvard University note that ancient discoveries of mammoth bones, prehistoric animal remains, and fossilized skeletons strongly influenced giant traditions across numerous civilizations. Large extinct creatures naturally appeared human-like to populations lacking anatomical knowledge needed for accurate interpretation. Still, historians continue debating whether fossil discovery merely reinforced existing giant myths or actively inspired entire traditions from the beginning. You move deeper into the ruined settlement while torchlight flickers across worn stone carvings. Some figures appear unusually tall compared with ordinary human proportions. Others depict battles between enormous warriors and smaller soldiers armed with spears. Ancient art often exaggerates symbolic importance through size differences, yet frightened visitors interpret the imagery literally. Fear reshapes observation quickly. A curious footnote preserved within later traditions claims certain rulers displayed massive bones inside temples or royal courts as proof supporting stories about ancient giants. Imagine entering a ceremonial hall where enormous fossilized femurs stand upright beside incense burners and sacred banners. Visitors would leave deeply convinced. Physical evidence changes legends into certainty. In your ears, loose gravel shifts beneath careful footsteps while explorers descend toward partially collapsed burial chambers beneath the city ruins. Oil lamps reveal cracked pottery, broken weapons, and scattered bones protruding from hardened earth. One skeleton appears strangely large compared with others nearby. Everyone stops breathing briefly. One scandalous aside appearing in medieval retellings describes grave robbers secretly selling oversized bones to wealthy collectors, eager for relics connected with giants. Ancient curiosity created profitable markets long before museums existed. Extraordinary objects always attract attention, especially frightening ones. Research discussed by scholars associated with the University of California highlights how ancient and medieval societies frequently misunderstood fossil remains through religious or mythological frameworks. Mammoth skulls, for example, sometimes resemble giant cyclopean heads due to large central nasal cavities interpreted as eye sockets. Human imagination fills gaps instinctively. You continue wandering through crumbling streets where weeds push between broken stones and faded murals peel from sun-baked walls. The city feels abandoned not merely by people but by time itself. Every ruin invites questions nobody can answer completely. Who lived here? Why did they disappear? Were the stories true? A mainstream historical observation discussed within research connected with Oxford University notes that rediscovered ruins often became linked with legendary races or divine punishment narratives. Monumental architecture surviving beyond collective memory appeared supernatural to later populations encountering it unexpectedly. The Nephilim traditions fit neatly into that pattern. Yet no agreement has been reached regarding how much actual archaeological discovery influenced evolving giant folklore compared with purely literary traditions passed between generations. Perhaps the two fed each other constantly. Your mind drifts through crowded ancient taverns where travellers exchange rumours beside smoky fires and bitter wine. Someone claims giant skeletons were uncovered near northern cliffs. Another swears priests hide enormous bones beneath temple floors to prevent public panic. Every retelling grows slightly larger. Stories expand naturally in dim rooms. Oddly enough, even skeptical listeners struggle dismissing physical discoveries entirely. Ancient people handled real bones. They saw gigantic remains emerging from hillsides and caves. Without paleontology, many conclusions seem perfectly reasonable. The earth held evidence of enormous being. Whether those beings matched the Nephilim legends exactly mattered less than emotional certainty created by discovery itself. You walk toward the centre of the ruined city where an enormous stone platform rises above surrounding debris. Cracked pillars lean dangerously beneath open sky, while faded carvings depict ceremonial processions long vanished from living memory. Nearby explorers speak quietly about local legends claiming giant kings once ruled this place before divine judgment destroyed them. The old flood stories return again. Arguments among historians connected with Stanford University remain lively, concerning whether ancient societies interpreted abandoned ruins primarily through fear or admiration. Some researchers believe giant myths expressed anxiety surrounding lost civilizations and forgotten power. Others argue these traditions reflected nostalgia for imagined golden ages populated by stronger, grander ancestors. Both emotions appear surprisingly compatible. For a moment, cool wind moves through the shattered city carrying the scent of dry grass and distant rain. Shadows lengthen across broken courtyards while birds circle silently above ruined towers. You realize how easily ancient travelers could believe supernatural history lingered within places like this. The atmosphere itself encourages belief. Night approaches slowly now. Explorers gather their findings carefully before retreating from the ruins. Nobody wishes to remain here after darkness settles fully across the empty streets. Too many stories cling to these stones already. As you leave the forgotten city behind, moonlight begins illuminating cracked walls and buried chambers once more. Beneath the earth lie bones, fossils, memories, and unanswered questions layered together through countless centuries. And somewhere within that tangled silence, the giants continue breathing through human imagination. The ruined city fades behind you, beneath silver moonlight, yet its silence lingers in your thoughts long after the road bends away. Travellers rarely leave such places unchanged. Once people believed traces of giants sleep beneath the earth, every strange stone and every oversized bone begins carrying deeper meaning. And somewhere nearby, scribes continue writing. You enter a quieter world now, temple libraries, candle-lit chambers, narrow rooms lined with clay tablets, reed pennants, and carefully preserved scrolls. Outside, crowded cities rise and fall through warfare and trade. Inside these rooms, memory becomes permanent, or at least people hope it does. For a moment, it feels as though you sit beside an aging scribe working beneath soft lamplight scented with warm oil and old papyrus. His fingers move slowly across prepared surfaces, while distant rain taps gently against roof tiles overhead. Shelves around him contain generations of stories copied by countless careful hands. Some accounts are considered dangerous. The traditions surrounding the Watchers grow more detailed during this era of organized writing. Earlier oral tales become structured narratives preserved by educated elites. Scribes collect scattered memories about heavenly beings descending upon mountains long ago. They record forbidden knowledge shared with humanity. They describe giant offsprings bringing violence into the world before the flood. The stories harden into text. Records examined by the researchers connected with the University of Chicago note that once myths enter written form, they often gain greater authority and complexity simultaneously. Oral storytelling allows flexibility. Written traditions encourage preservation commentary and theological interpretation across generations. The Watchers begin transforming from wandering legends into subjects of serious intellectual debate. You continue through dim archive halls where scribes whisper carefully while organizing fragile manuscripts wrapped in linen. Some texts remain publicly accepted. Others circulate quietly among select scholars fascinated by hidden knowledge and ancient mysteries. Forbidden writings always attracted attention. A curious footnote preserved within certain traditions claims some scribes believed the Watchers revealed secret sciences beyond warfare alone. Astronomy, herbal medicine, mathematics, and celestial observation all became associated with heavenly instruction. Ancient listeners likely found this idea both thrilling and unsettling. Knowledge carries moral weight here. In your ears, reed pens scratch steadily across rough surfaces, while apprentices grind ink from soot and crushed minerals nearby. The room smells faintly of cedar shelves, warm wax and dust collected through decades of careful storage. Outside, ordinary citizens continue daily life unaware of the debates unfolding within scholarly circles. Words shape civilizations quietly. One scandalous aside appearing in later interpretation suggests certain religious authorities attempted restricting access to texts discussing the Watchers too openly. The concern feels understandable. Stories involving heavenly beings breaking sacred boundaries raise difficult theological questions. Why would divine guardians rebel? Could forbidden knowledge ever truly benefit humanity? Who deserved access to dangerous truths? Research discussed by scholars associated with Yale University highlights how ancient religious communities often preserved competing interpretations simultaneously within broader textual traditions. Contradictions were not always considered flaws. Instead, multiple perspectives reflected ongoing conversations about morality, authority, and human nature. No agreement existed even among ancient readers themselves. You walk beside younger scribes carrying fresh manuscripts between library chambers, while senior scholars debate interpretations in hushed voices nearby. Some insist the Watchers symbolize moral corruption entering human society. Others view them as cautionary examples about pride and disobedience. A few remain fascinated by the possibility that divine knowledge once genuinely touched the earth. The tension never fully resolves. A mainstream historical observation discussed within research connected with Princeton University notes that ancient intellectual communities frequently blended mythology, theology, astronomy, and natural philosophy together, without modern distinctions separating those fields today. Stories about heavenly beings therefore occupied both spiritual and intellectual importance. The Watchers were not merely monsters, they represented cosmic disorder itself. Your mind drifts toward isolated scholars studying stars from temple rooftops beneath cold midnight skies. They track planetary movements carefully while recalling ancient stories about beings descending from the heavens long ago. The boundary between astronomy and mythology feels surprisingly thin in such moments. Above them stretches endless mystery. Oddly enough, giant traditions also evolved through scholarly interpretation during this period. Earlier tales emphasizing brute strength gradually expand into discussions about corruption, excess, and broken boundaries between worlds. The Nephilim become symbols carrying moral lessons far beyond physical size alone. Ancient writers deepen the narrative constantly. Arguments among modern historians connected with Harvard University continue regarding how these written traditions influenced later religious thought across multiple cultures. Some scholars emphasize literary development shaped by political upheaval and exile. Others focus upon older oral traditions preserved beneath evolving theological frameworks. The debates remain active because the texts themselves contain layers from different eras woven together carefully over centuries. For a moment, thunder rolls softly outside while library attendants secure shutters against approaching storms. Oil lamps flicker across rows of manuscripts containing flood stories, giant legends, royal histories, and prayers copied by generations now long dead. Knowledge survives through fragile hands. You notice how the act of writing changes the emotional atmosphere surrounding the Nephilim. Oral tales feel immediate and fluid. Written accounts feel deliberate, weighty, permanent. Once stories settle onto parchment and clay, they begin influencing future civilizations far beyond their original audiences. The Watchers enter history through ink. In your ears, pages rustle gently while exhausted scribes stretch aching fingers beside fading lamps. Some worry their work preserves dangerous ideas. Others believe recording the past honestly matters more than fear. Ancient scholarship carried genuine risk when sacred subjects became controversial. Still, they continue copying, because people always hunger for explanations surrounding mystery, disaster, and forbidden knowledge. Night deepens around the library now. Rain taps softly across stone courtyards while distant temple bells echo through sleeping streets. Somewhere among the shelves rests another, carefully preserved account describing giants born beneath troubled heavens before the flood reshaped the earth. And as long as those stories survive, the Watchers themselves never entirely vanish. Rainwater still glistens across the temple courtyards when dawn finally arrives. The storm has cooled the city, leaving thin mist drifting between stone columns and narrow alleyways. Priests move quietly through the early morning, carrying incense burners that release curling smoke into pale air. Somewhere nearby, bells sound softly above waking streets. The debates continue long before sunrise. You enter a chamber reserved for scholars and religious teachers, a place where worn manuscripts cover low wooden tables beneath flickering lamps. The room smells of parchment olive oil and damp wool cloaks, drying after the night's storm. Outside, ordinary life slowly resumes. Inside, arguments about heaven and humanity grow sharper with every generation. The Watchers remain deeply troubling figures. For a moment, it feels as though you sit among the gathered scholars yourself. One elderly teacher traces careful lines across an ancient manuscript while younger students listen closely nearby. Another priest shakes his head in frustration, insisting certain stories should never have circulated so widely among common people. The questions disturb everyone. If heavenly beings descended willingly into the human world, what did that imply about divine order? If forbidden knowledge transformed civilization, was knowledge itself dangerous? And if giants once walked the earth as children of broken boundaries, could such corruption return again? Nobody reaches easy conclusions. Records examined by historians connected with Stanford University note that ancient religious communities often struggled balancing inherited mythic traditions with evolving theological systems. Stories surviving from older periods sometimes conflicted with later concepts of morality, cosmic hierarchy, and divine perfection. The Nephilim traditions became especially difficult because they blurred categories ancient societies preferred keeping separate. You continue listening while scholars debate interpretations in measured voices. Some insist the Watchers symbolize temptation alone, cautionary figures representing human arrogance projected onto heavenly beings. Others argue the stories preserve literal supernatural events from a distant age before the flood. A few remain uncertain, and uncertainty unveils institution. One curious footnote preserved within later commentary traditions claims certain priests feared ordinary listeners would become too fascinated by the Watchers themselves rather than the moral warnings attached to their story. Forbidden figures often attract admiration despite cautionary intentions. Ancient audiences were no different from modern ones in that respect. Dangerous knowledge can appear strangely beautiful. In your ears, the sound changes into soft page turning while students copy passages from older texts onto fresh materials. Some manuscripts emphasize the giant's violence, others focus upon heavenly rebellion. A handful describe the Watchers teaching humanity arts that later civilizations still depended upon. The contradictions refuse disappearing. Research discussed by scholars associated with Oxford University highlights how ancient theological traditions frequently preserved multiple competing explanations simultaneously, rather than enforcing single fixed interpretations immediately. Debate itself became part of intellectual life within many religious communities. No agreement has ever fully emerged concerning how literally ancient audiences understood stories about the Nephilim and the Watchers. That ambiguity keeps the legends alive. You walk through shaded temple corridors where murals depict floods, stars, winged beings, and towering warriors beneath dark clouds. Worshippers passing through these spaces absorb ancient symbolism almost unconsciously. Stories shape emotional worlds even for those unable to read formal text directly. Myth travels through architecture too. A mainstream historical observation discussed within research connected with the University of Cambridge notes that religious storytelling often served as moral psychology for ancient societies. Narratives about divine judgment, rebellion, and corrupted power helped communities define acceptable behavior while reinforcing social stability. The Watchers represented boundaries crossed recklessly. The giants represented consequences growing beyond control. For a moment, warm incense thickens the air while distant chanting echoes through nearby halls. You notice younger students glancing nervously toward illustrations showing enormous figures standing beside collapsing cities. Even symbolic giants inspire emotional reaction surprisingly quickly. Scale affects imagination deeply. One scandalous aside circulating among certain scholarly circles claims hidden texts existed describing additional secrets taught by the Watchers before the flood. Astrology beyond approved teachings, hidden medicines, strange rituals connected with stars and dreams. Whether genuine traditions or rumour layered upon rumour, such whispers spread fascination alongside fear. Forbidden books rarely remain forgotten for long. Your mind drifts toward isolated monks and scholars preserving controversial writings quietly despite institutional discomfort. History repeatedly shows that suppressing ideas often increases curiosity surrounding them. The more authorities caution restraint, the more listeners lean closer. Human nature remains consistent. Arguments among modern historians connected with Yale University continue regarding whether ancient debates about the Watchers reflected deeper cultural tensions surrounding foreign influence, technological change, and shifting social structures. Some scholars interpret these stories politically, others emphasize spiritual symbolism or literary development instead. The legends support many readings simultaneously. Perhaps that flexibility explains their endurance. You continue through crowded temple courtyards where ordinary citizens bring offerings, seek blessings, and ask priests for guidance concerning illness, harvests, marriages, and storms. Most people never study theological arguments directly, yet the emotional atmosphere created by such stories shapes daily life regardless. The world feels morally charged. Every drought suggests possible judgment. Every unusual star invites speculation. Every towering warrior reminds listeners of older giant legends waiting beneath civilization's surface. Oddly enough, the debates themselves become part of the tradition over time. Later generations inherit not only stories about the Watchers, but also centuries of disagreement surrounding their meaning. Questions survive alongside answers, maybe longer. Night approaches once more while scholars extinguish lamps one by one across the temple library. Outside, cool air carries the scent of wet stone and cedar smoke through quiet streets. Somewhere beyond the city walls, shepherds guide flocks beneath widening stars exactly as their ancestors once did when the first stories began. And high above those silent hills, the heavens remain vast enough for mystery to endure. The temple debates fade gradually behind you while the wider world grows louder again. Roads expand between kingdoms. Merchant ships crowd busy harbours, scented with salt tar and smoked fish. Caravans cross deserts carrying copper spices, timber wine, and stories gathered from every direction beneath the sun. Legends travel efficiently alongside trade. You move through a bustling port city where sailors shout across crowded docks while gulls wheel overhead in pale morning light. Foreign languages blend together beneath the creaking of ropes and wooden hulls. Somewhere nearby, musicians play sharp rhythmic melodies beside open tavern doors. Every traveller brings news, and every rumour changes slightly during the journey. For a moment, it feels as though you sit beside wandering merchants sharing stories over warm bread and dark wine after months spent crossing dangerous roads. One sailor describes mountain tribes claiming descent from ancient giants. Another insists enormous skeletons were uncovered during construction near a distant river kingdom. Nobody entirely dismisses such claims. The Nephilim legends now spread far beyond their earliest cultural origins. As empires expand and trade routes connect distant societies, older stories blend with local traditions and encountered along the way. Giant figures appear in new forms across expanding civilizations. Some become heroic ancestors, others remain terrifying reminders of divine judgment. The emotional core survives every adaptation. Records examined by historians connected with Harvard University note that ancient trade networks carried religious ideas and mythological motifs remarkably efficiently across large geographic regions. Merchant soldiers, pilgrims, and migrants constantly exchange stories alongside goods reshaping traditions through repeated contact. The Watchers and Giants became part of this larger cultural circulation. You continue walking through crowded marketplaces where imported goods from distant lands rest beside local pottery and woven fabrics. Nearby storytellers entertain evening audiences with dramatic tales involving enormous warriors, heavenly rebels, and vanished civilizations swallowed by catastrophe. Audiences lean closer instinctively. A curious footnote preserved within certain historical traditions claims some rulers deliberately encourage giant legends connected with conquered territories. Portraying enemies as monstrous or ancient reinforced imperial authority, while making military victories appear cosmically significant. Politics rarely ignores mythology. In your ears, ship masts knock rhythmically together while waves strike harbour walls below. Sailors whisper about dangerous islands where giant bones supposedly litter remote caves. Caravan leaders mention abandoned fortresses too massive for ordinary builders. Every route develops its own variation eventually. The world feels crowded with echoes. Research discussed by scholars associated with the University of Chicago highlights how expanding empires often absorbed local myths into broader cultural frameworks rather than erasing them completely. Giant traditions survived because they adapted successfully to changing political landscapes. No agreement exists among historians regarding exactly how much direct cultural borrowing occurred between specific ancient civilizations sharing giant narratives. Still, similarities remain difficult to ignore. You drift through torchlit streets after sunset while travelers gather inside crowded inns filled with smoke, laughter, and exhaustion. One storyteller performs dramatic scenes describing heavenly beings descending upon mountain peaks before the flood. Another recounts ancient kings claiming blood ties to giant ancestors. The stories now belong to everyone. One scandalous aside circulating among merchants claims certain collectors pay enormous sums for artifacts supposedly connected with the giants. Oversized weapons, unusual bones, strange carved tablets. Whether authentic or fraudulent matters less than public fascination surrounding such objects. Mystery creates value naturally. A mainstream historical observation discussed within research connected with Columbia University notes that shared myths help diverse populations communicate across cultural boundaries in the ancient world. Familiar narrative themes created emotional connections between strangers speaking different languages and following different customs. The giant stories functioned almost like a shared symbolic vocabulary. Power, corruption, lost greatness, divine punishment. Every civilization recognized those themes. For a moment, cool evening air carries the scent of sea salt and burning oil, while lantern light reflects across dark harbour water. Nearby sailors prepare for another voyage toward unfamiliar coastlines, where fresh versions of old legends await them. The stories never remain still. Your mind drifts toward imperial roads stretching across mountains and deserts beneath endless skies. Soldiers march beside merchants. Priests travel beside diplomats. Everywhere they go, fragments of older traditions attach themselves to local beliefs already waiting there. The Watchers gain new names. The Giants gain new faces. Yet the underlying fears remain surprisingly consistent. Oddly enough, expanding literacy also changes how these stories spread during this period. Written manuscripts travel farther than oral traditions alone ever could. Scribes copy giant legends into new languages. Religious commentaries reinterpret older tales for unfamiliar audiences. Ideas once confined to isolated regions now circulate across continents. The ancient world becomes interconnected slowly. Arguments among modern historians connected with Princeton University continue regarding whether giant myths spread primarily through direct cultural exchange or emerged independently from universal human experiences involving power and unexplained discoveries. Perhaps both processes unfolded together naturally across centuries. You continue beside heavily loaded caravans moving beneath moonlit skies, while guards watch surrounding hills carefully for raiders. Around the campfire, exhausted travellers exchange stories before sleep overtakes them. One man swears giant footprints appeared beside an oasis weeks earlier. Another laughs nervously yet avoids sleeping near the edge of camp afterward. Belief rarely requires certainty. Night deepens across the ancient trade routes now. Far beyond the harbour, cities and temple libraries, the world remains vast enough for mystery to survive comfortably. Every mountain range hides unfamiliar valleys. Every desert conceals forgotten ruins beneath shifting sands. And wherever uncertainty flourishes, stories about the children of the Watchers continue finding new homes. The roads continue carrying you westward through a changing world where older traditions meet ambitious new civilizations. Harbours grow larger. Stone temples become grander. Philosophers gather beneath shaded courtyards discussing truth, nature, and the hidden structure of existence itself. And among these conversations the giants return again. You arrive in lively coastal cities where marble columns shine beneath warm sunlight and olive trees sway gently above crowded public squares. Fishmongers shout across busy markets while students follow respected teachers through narrow streets carrying wax tablets beneath their arms. Ideas travel quickly here, sometimes faster than armies. For a moment, it feels as though you sit within a candlelit hall listening to scholars debate ancient stories late into the evening. Wine cups rest beside rolled manuscripts, while sea wind slips softly through open shutters, carrying the scent of salt and distant rain. The older legends have reached philosophical minds now. Greek thinkers inherit giant traditions through contact with neighbouring cultures, trade routes, conquest and migration. Yet they rarely preserve stories unchanged. Instead, they reinterpret them through their own intellectual frameworks. Giants become symbols of chaos, arrogance, rebellion against divine order, or remnants from an earlier age before civilization fully emerged. The stories grow more layered. Records examined by historians connected with Oxford University note that Greek writers frequently absorbed foreign myths and reshape them according to local philosophical and cultural priorities. Earlier Near Eastern traditions blended gradually with Greek ideas surrounding cosmic struggle, heroic ancestry, and divine punishment. The result feels familiar yet transformed. You continue through public gathering spaces where travelling poets perform dramatic tales about enormous beings battling gods across mountains and storm-filled skies. Audiences listen with fascination while children stare wide-eyed beneath torchlight. Scale still captivates human imagination. A curious footnote preserved within several ancient accounts claims certain Greek travellers visiting older civilizations became deeply fascinated by giant legends already established there. Some reportedly collected stories about ancient floods, heavenly rebels, and oversized warrior races from priests and scribes encountered abroad. Cultures borrow mystery eagerly. In your ears, sandals strike polished stone while philosophers walk slowly beneath shaded colonnades discussing whether giant myths reflect historical memory or symbolic truth. One teacher argues such stories represent humanity struggling against untamed nature. Another insists they preserve echoes from forgotten prehistoric ages. Nobody fully agrees. Research discussed by scholars associated with Harvard University highlights how Greek intellectual traditions often sought rational explanations for inherited myths without abandoning them completely. Philosophers reinterpreted legendary material through allegory, natural philosophy, and moral symbolism rather than simple dismissal. The giants survived because they adapted intellectually. One scandalous aside harshly tasting among later writers, claims some wealthy collectors displayed enormous bones within private villas as conversation pieces proving ancient giant races truly existed. Fossils remained persuasive long before scientific classification emerged. People trust what they can touch. A mainstream historical observation discussed within research connected with Yale University notes that Greek authors frequently describe distant lands as inhabited by unusual peoples possessing extraordinary size or abilities. Such descriptions reflected both genuine curiosity about unfamiliar cultures and literary traditions, exaggerating the exotic nature of remote territories. The unknown always grows larger at civilization's edges. Your mind drifts toward mountain sanctuaries where priests maintain sacred fears beneath towering cliffs wrapped in storm clouds. Pilgrims climbing these paths hear old stories about divine battles shaping the world before recorded history. The atmosphere itself encourages mythic thinking. Nature feels enormous there. Oddly enough, Greek reinterpretations of giant traditions often emphasize pride more strongly than earlier versions. The giants become cautionary examples showing what happens when beings challenge cosmic order directly. Strength alone proves insufficient against divine balance. Hubris destroys even the mighty. Arguments among modern historians connected with Stanford University continue regarding how much Greek giant mythology drew directly from earlier Near Eastern traditions versus independently evolving local narratives about chaos and divine authority. The debate remains complicated because ancient cultures exchanged ideas constantly through trade, migration, and conquest. Influence moved in many directions simultaneously. You walk beside crowded theatres where actors wearing elaborate masks perform scenes involving titanic battles and collapsing kingdom beneath roaring audiences. Public storytelling transforms ancient fears into communal spectacle. People laugh, gasp, and shiver together beneath open night skies. The giants become entertainment as well as warning. For a moment, warm bread and rosemary drift through evening streets while musicians play soft melodies beside glowing taverns. Nearby sailors recount rumours about enormous skeletons discovered on distant islands after storms expose buried caves. No matter how sophisticated societies become, giant stories remain strangely difficult to abandon completely. Research discussed within publications associated with the University of Chicago notes that myths involving oversized beings frequently persist because they address enduring psychological themes surrounding power, mortality, and humanity's relationship with forces larger than itself. The emotional truth matters more than literal belief for many listeners. You notice how philosophers and ordinary citizens approach the legends differently. Scholars debate symbolism and historical origins. Common audiences simply enjoy the mystery. Yet both groups remain emotionally drawn towards stories about ancient giants walking the earth beneath troubled heavens. Some fascinations survive every intellectual age. Night settles softly across the coastal cities now. Moonlight reflects across calm harbour waters, while distant conversations fade gradually into silence. Somewhere within a candlelit study, a thoughtful writer copies older giant stories into new forms for future generations, and with every retelling, the children of the Watchers step further into immortality. The coastal winds grow sharper as the world changes once again beneath expanding empires. Roads stretch farther than ever before. Armies march across continents carrying banners, laws, languages, and inherited myths gathered from conquered peoples along the way. Now Rome rises. You travel beside disciplined soldiers, moving steadily along broad stone roads, cutting through forests, valleys, and crowded provinces. Iron armor clinks softly with every step. Campfires glow across military encampments after sunset, while officers study maps beneath flickering lantern light. Empires collect stories almost as aggressively as territories. For a moment, it feels as though you stand inside a grand Roman hall, decorated with marble statues and painted ceilings. Wealthy officials recline beside low tables discussing politics, philosophy, and strange legends arriving from distant provinces recently absorbed into imperial control. The giant traditions enter Rome carrying centuries of accumulated meaning. Roman writers inherit stories shaped by earlier civilizations, especially Greek interpretations surrounding rebellious giants and cosmic conflict. Yet Roman culture reshapes these tales again according to imperial values, emphasizing order, authority, discipline, and civilization triumphing over chaos. The symbolism becomes politically useful. Records examined by historians connected with Princeton University note that Roman intellectual life frequently absorbed foreign myths while reframing them through imperial ideology. Stories involving giants often represented barbarism, disorder, or primal violence eventually subdued by lawful civilization. Rome cast itself as the force restoring balance. You continue through crowded Roman streets where merchants sell imported spices beside bronze tools and fine cloth gathered from every corner of the empire. Public baths steam beneath vaulted ceilings, while nearby temples honour countless gods collected through conquest and cultural exchange. Everything becomes Roman eventually, or tries to. A curious footnote preserved within certain Roman accounts describes enormous bones displayed publicly after accidental discoveries during construction projects or military campaigns. Citizens gathered eagerly around such findings, debating whether they belonged to ancient heroes, giants, or monstrous creatures from forgotten ages. Fossils remained persuasive evidence. In your ears, chariot wheels rumble across stone roads while public speakers address noisy crowds gathered near market squares. Some performers dramatize ancient battles involving enormous beings challenging divine authority before inevitable destruction follows. Roman audiences enjoy spectacle immensely. It's my pussy. One scandalous aside appearing in later writings claims certain emperors encouraged associations between themselves and legendary heroic figures powerful enough to defeat giants. Imperial propaganda understood symbolic storytelling perfectly well. Heroes become larger through carefully managed myths. Research discussed by scholars associated with Harvard University highlights how Roman culture transformed inherited legends into moral and political instruction. Giant narratives reinforced themes concerning discipline, overcoming excess civilization, defeating savagery, and lawful authority restoring order after chaos. The stories served empire effectively, yet no agreement exists among historians regarding how literally ordinary Roman citizens believed tales involving ancient giants versus appreciating them primarily as literary tradition and public entertainment. Perhaps belief varied depending upon audience education and circumstance. You walk through massive amphitheatres crowded with cheering spectators, while dramatic performances depict gods, monsters, and legendary catastrophes beneath painted backdrops. Public imagination remains deeply attached to stories involving overwhelming scale and divine conflict. Bigger always commands attention. Your mind drifts toward frontier regions where Roman soldiers encounter unfamiliar landscapes and local traditions beyond imperial centres. In distant mountains and forests, older giant myths persist stubbornly among conquered peoples, despite Roman attempts at cultural integration. Empire never fully erases older fears. A mainstream historical observation discussed within research connected with Columbia University notes that frontier societies often preserved mythological traditions more intensely than urban centres, because isolation encouraged continuity of local storytelling practices across generations. The giants survived especially well in remote places. Oddly enough, Roman fascination with ancestry and heroic lineage also kept giant traditions alive indirectly. Noble families frequently exaggerated genealogies connecting themselves with legendary founders, divine favour, or extraordinary historical fauxpas. Ancient greatness became social currency. People always hunger for connection with powerful origins. Arguments among modern historians connected with Yale University continue regarding whether Roman reinterpretations weakened belief in giant traditions through rationalization, or strengthened them by spreading familiar stories across enormous territories under unified administration. The empire amplified everything it touched. For a moment, cool evening rain taps softly against tiled rooftops while senators debate philosophy beneath glowing oil lamps. Nearby scribes copy older texts discussing floods, heavenly rebellion, and ancient races destroyed long ago. Roman scholarship preserves as much as it transforms. The stories continue, surviving through adaptation. You notice how giant narratives gradually become more historical in tone during this era. Earlier traditions often feel immediate and sacred. Roman writers increasingly frame giants as beings belonging to remote antiquity, part of a distant world preceding organized civilization. Myth moves deeper into the past, Still, emotional fascination never disappears completely. Travellers continue reporting strange discoveries from isolated regions. Farmers still uncover massive bones while digging foundations. Children still stare wide-eyed during dramatic retellings performed beneath torchlight. Human imagination remains receptive. In your ears, distant thunder rolls beyond the city walls while soldiers prepare for another campaign toward unfamiliar lands. Somewhere beyond imperial borders, forests and mountains still conceal mysteries Rome cannot fully control. And in those shadows, the ancient giants continue waiting patiently within memory, rumour, and restless dreams. The empire grows quieter now beneath changing centuries. Roads still stretch across vast territories, yet uncertainty creeps through cities once overflowing with confidence. Temples stand beside newer places of worship. Old beliefs fade slowly, while emerging faiths struggle to define themselves against inherited traditions. And among the most troubling inherited stories remain the giants. You walk through narrow streets lit by oil lamps where early Christian communities gather carefully behind closed doors. The air smells of bread smoke, damp stone, and nervous anticipation. Outside, imperial politics shift constantly. Inside, believers debate sacred writings with intense seriousness. Every word matters deeply now. For a moment, it feels as though you sit within a modest gathering room while teachers read ancient passages aloud beside flickering candles. Listeners lean forward quietly wrapped in wool cloaks against the evening cold. Some passages inspire comfort, others provoke visible unease. The Nephilim belong firmly to the second category. Early Christian thinkers inherit centuries of debate surrounding the Watchers and the Giants. Yet the growing faith faces difficult questions. How should these mysterious beings fit within emerging theology? Were the Watchers fallen angels? Symbolic figures, corrupt rulers described metaphorically. Different communities answer differently. The disagreements become surprisingly intense. Records examined by historians connected with the University of Cambridge note that early Christian writers frequently wrestled with older Jewish traditions concerning rebellious heavenly beings and giant offspring. Some theologians embraced these stories literally. Others worried such interpretations complicated core teachings about divine order and salvation. The uncertainty never fully disappears. You continue through dim corridors where exhausted scribes copy sacred texts carefully by hand while religious leaders debate interpretation nearby. Certain writings discussing the Watchers circulate widely among believers for a time. Other authorities grow cautious, fearing confusion or theological instability. Ideas compete constantly during periods of religious formation. A curious footnote preserved within several early commentaries claims ordinary believers remained fascinated by giant stories even when church leaders attempted emphasizing different theological priorities. Ancient mysteries attract attention naturally, especially during uncertain historical periods. People crave cosmic explanations when worlds feel unstable. In your ears, rain taps softly against shuttered windows while distant bells echo through sleeping streets. A teacher speaks quietly about pride corrupting heavenly beings before the flood. Another warns listeners against becoming too obsessed with hidden knowledge and supernatural speculation. The old themes return again. Research discussed by scholars associated with Harvard University highlights how early Christian communities inherited complex literary traditions from multiple cultural sources simultaneously. Debates surrounding angels, giants, and divine rebellion reflected broader struggles concerning authority, scripture, and spiritual interpretation within rapidly expanding religious movements. No agreement existed universally. One scandalous aside circulating among certain communities claimed forbidden books contained fuller accounts about the Watchers than officially accepted writings allowed. Curious believers copied and shared such texts secretly, despite growing institutional caution. Suppressed stories rarely vanish quietly. You walk beside crowded urban neighborhoods where ordinary citizens face poverty, political instability, disease, and occasional persecution. In such environments, stories about cosmic battles between heavenly and corrupt forces feel emotionally immediate rather than abstract. The world itself appears spiritually contested. A mainstream historical observation discussed within research connected with Yale University notes that apocalyptic thinking often intensifies during periods of social disruption and imperial uncertainty. Narratives involving fallen powers, divine judgment, and ancient corruption gain renewed relevance when civilizations feel fragile. The giant traditions fit naturally into that emotional atmosphere. Your mind drifts toward isolated desert communities where monks withdraw from crowded cities, seeking spiritual clarity through solitude and prayer. Beneath endless stars, they contemplate ancient texts describing heavenly rebellion before the flood reshaped the earth. Silence deepens difficult questions. Oddly enough, some early Christian writers reinterpret the Nephilim less as physical giants and more as symbols of moral corruption spreading through humanity. Others preserve literal supernatural readings enthusiastically. The diversity of interpretation becomes part of the tradition itself. Ancient stories rarely remain fixed. Arguments among modern historians connected with Stanford University continue regarding how influential giant traditions truly were within early Christian thought overall. Some researchers emphasize their importance during formative theological debates. Others argue fascination with the Nephilim remained more marginal than modern audiences often assume. The evidence supports multiple perspectives. For a moment, cold night air carries the scent of wet earth and olive trees, while believers gather quietly for prayer before dawn. Candles flicker across worn manuscripts containing flood narratives, angelic rebellion, and warnings about pride leading creation toward destruction. The emotional resonance remains powerful. You notice how early Christians approach giant traditions with both fascination and caution simultaneously. The stories offer dramatic explanations for evil entering the world, yet they also risk distracting believers toward excessive speculation about hidden mysteries rather than practical spiritual life. That tension never fully resolves. In your ears, pages rustle gently while an exhausted scribe pauses to rest cramped fingers beside fading lamplight. He understands his work may shape future generations long after empires crumble around him. Words survive surprisingly well. Night stretches quietly across the ancient cities now. Somewhere beyond crowded streets, storms gather above distant mountains exactly as they did when the first stories about the Watchers began centuries earlier. And still humanity continues asking the same restless question beneath those dark skies. What truly happened before the flood? The centuries drift onward like slow river water beneath moonlight. Empires weaken, borders fracture. Great cities shrink behind crumbling walls, while forests reclaim abandoned roads once crowded with soldiers and merchants. Across much of the world, uncertainty settles quietly over ordinary life. Yet inside monasteries, the stories survive. You travel through cold countryside beneath pale winter skies, where isolated stone monasteries rise from hillside wrapped in mist. Bells echo softly across frozen fields, while monks move silently through narrow corridors carrying candles against the darkness. The outside world feels unstable. Inside these walls, time slows. For a moment, it feels as though you sit within a monastery library, warmed faintly by smoking hearth fires and beeswax candles. The air smells of parchment-damp wool robes and old wood polished smooth through generations of careful hands. Rows of manuscripts rest beneath protective cloth coverings. Some contain sacred teachings copied endlessly for preservation. Others preserve history's legends and older writings inherited from vanished civilizations. Among them survive accounts of the Watchers, the Flood, and the giants who once walked the earth before divine judgment fell. The monks copy them carefully. Records examined by historians connected with Oxford University note that medieval monasteries played crucial roles preserving ancient literature during periods of political fragmentation and declining urban literacy. Without monastic scribes, countless historical and religious texts would likely have disappeared entirely. The Nephilim tradition survived partly because tired hands kept rewriting fading pages, You continue through dim scriptoria where monks bend over wooden desks for hours beneath flickering candlelight. Ink stains darken their fingers, their backs ache constantly. Winter cold creeps through stone walls despite small fires struggling against damp air. Still they continue copying. A curious footnote preserved within several medieval chronicles claims some monks felt uneasy while reproducing texts discussing rebellious heavenly beings and giant offspring. Yet preserving inherited knowledge remained sacred duty regardless of personal comfort. Faith and curiosity often coexist uneasily. In your ears, quills scratch softly across parchment, while distant chanting echoes through monastery halls before dawn prayers begin. Outside, snow falls quietly across empty roads where travellers rarely pass during harsh weather. Isolation deepens contemplation. Research discussed by scholars associated with Harvard University highlights how medieval monastic culture balanced reverence for sacred authority with fascination toward inherited mysteries from earlier eras. Monks preserved many writings precisely because they considered understanding the past spiritually important, even when certain stories remained difficult or controversial. No agreement existed regarding how literally giant traditions should be interpreted. One scandalous aside circulating through some medieval communities claimed enormous bones, occasionally uncovered during farming or construction, belonged to the ancient giants described in scripture and legend. Monasteries sometimes displayed such discoveries as curiosities inspiring awe among local villagers. Fossils still shape belief powerfully. You walk beside candle-lit shelves where manuscripts copied centuries earlier now rest beside newer commentaries attempting explaining difficult passages about the Watchers. Some scholars interpret the giants symbolically as embodiments of pride and violence. Others defend literal readings firmly. The debates never truly vanish. A mainstream historical observation discussed within research connected with Yale University notes that medieval Europeans often understood history through layered sacred timelines connecting biblical events directly with their own world. Ancient giants therefore felt less like distant mythology and more like part of humanity's shared historical memory. The past remained emotionally close. Your mind drifts toward weary travellers seeking shelter inside monasteries after dangerous journeys through forests and mountains. During evening meals, stories emerge naturally beside warm soup and crackling fires. Someone mentions giant bones discovered near a riverbank. Another describes ruins supposedly built by enormous ancient races. Long winters encourage storytelling. Oddly enough, medieval giant traditions sometimes blended with local folklore surrounding mountain spirits, wilderness beings, and forgotten kings sleeping beneath hills. Older pagan memories intertwined gradually with inherited religious narratives across remote regions. Stories adapt to local landscapes. Arguments among modern historians connected with the University of Chicago continue regarding how medieval audiences balance symbolic interpretation with literal belief concerning ancient giants. Some researchers argue educated clergy increasingly favoured allegory. Others note widespread popular belief remained remarkably concrete. Both perspectives likely existed simultaneously. For a moment, cold wind rattles monastery shutters while candle flames flicker across illuminated manuscripts decorated with painted giants towering above tiny human figures. The artwork feels dreamlike yet strangely sincere. Visual imagination preserves emotional truth even when historical certainty fades. You notice how medieval retellings often emphasize moral lessons connected with the giants more strongly than physical description alone. The Nephilim become warnings against pride, violence, uncontrolled desire, and spiritual corruption threatening societies whenever discipline weakens. The old flood still shadows human behavior. In your ears, church bells ring slowly through dark pre-dawn air while monks gather for prayer beneath vaulted ceilings scented with incense and melting wax. Beyond monastery walls, ordinary people sleep beneath fragile roofs while wolves move silently through distant forests. The world remains mysterious enough for giant stories to survive comfortably. Night eventually softens toward a grey morning. Snow rests quietly upon monastery rooftops while exhausted scribes cover finished manuscripts carefully before resting cramped hands. They cannot know their copied texts will travel across future centuries into worlds they could never imagine. Yet because they preserve these stories, the Watchers and their children endure, patiently waiting with an ink memory and candle-lit silence. The monastery bells fade behind you, while the medieval world slowly opens outward again. Trade routes revive, pilgrims travel farther from home, ships push beyond familiar coastlines searching for wealth-holy sites and forgotten wonders whispered about in crowded taverns. And wherever travellers go, giant stories follow close behind. You move along muddy roads crowded with pilgrims carrying walking staffs and weathered packs beneath grey skies. The smell of wet wool horse sweat and wood smoke drifts through roadside villages, where inns overflow with strangers exchanging rumours late into the night. The world feels larger now, and far less certain. For a moment it feels as though you sit inside a noisy medieval inn while rain hammers the roof overhead. Travellers warm stiff hands beside a crackling fire, while one exhausted merchant describes enormous bones uncovered near distant cliffs beyond the sea. Every listener turns toward him immediately. Medieval travellers often reported strange discoveries connected with giants. Some accounts described oversized skeletons emerging from riverbanks after floods exposed buried earth. Others claimed remote valleys contained ruins impossible for ordinary humans to construct. Pilgrims visiting ancient lands returned with dramatic stories blending local folklore, religious tradition, and personal imagination. The Nephilim legends adapted easily to these journeys. Records examined by historians connected with Stanford University note that medieval travel literature frequently mixed observation, exaggeration, symbolism, and inherited mythology together without strict separation. Travellers genuinely attempted describing unfamiliar experiences, yet cultural expectations shaped perception strongly. People often found what they already feared or hoped existed. You continue through crowded port towns where sailors prepare for dangerous voyages beneath dark, gull-filled skies. Harbour taverns buzz with rumours about distant islands inhabited by enormous people or cursed lands scattered with giant bones. Isolation magnifies storytelling quickly. A curious footnote preserved within several medieval chronicles claims certain rulers displayed massive skeletons publicly to attract pilgrims and strengthen local prestige. Whether authentic fossils or cleverly assembled remains mattered less than emotional impact upon visitors. Wonder itself became valuable. In your ears, wagon wheels creak through muddy streets while church bells echo faintly above crowded marketplaces. Nearby storytellers entertain audiences with dramatic accounts involving heroic knights battling giant enemies guarding mountain passes or hidden treasures. The old themes survive beneath new costumes. Research discussed by scholars associated with Princeton University highlights how medieval Europeans interpreted unusual archaeological discoveries through biblical and legendary frameworks inherited from earlier centuries. Fossils, ancient ruins, and oversized artifacts naturally reinforced beliefs concerning giants inhabiting the ancient world. No agreement exists among historians regarding how skeptical ordinary medieval audiences truly were towards such claims. Belief likely shifted constantly between fascination and doubt. One scandalous aside circulating among wandering pilgrims claimed certain monasteries secretly preserved enormous bones believed connected directly to the giants destroyed before the flood. Travellers crossed dangerous territories hoping merely to glimpse these mysterious relics. Human beings rarely resist sacred curiosities. Your mind drifts toward mountain monasteries perched above dangerous cliffs where isolated monks record stories brought by our passing travellers from distant lands. Some accounts describe gigantic warrior tribes beyond eastern deserts. Others mention buried cities revealed after earthquakes shattered ancient hillsides. Every journey adds another layer. A mainstream historical observation discussed within research connected with the University of Chicago notes that medieval pilgrimage routes functioned as enormous information networks, spreading folklore, religious traditions, and historical rumors across vast regions. Giant legends survived, partly because travellers continuously refreshed them with new local variations. The stories never remained static. Oddly enough, giant traditions during this era often blended fear with nostalgia. Ancient giants represented violence and divine punishment, yet also lost grandeur from a heroic age supposedly stronger and more dramatic than ordinary medieval life. People romanticized dangerous pasts surprisingly easily. You walk beside exhausted explorers crossing dense forests where twisted trees block fading sunlight from reaching narrow trails below. Wolves howl distantly after dark while guides whisper warnings about abandoned ruins hidden deeper among the hills. The wilderness still feels alive with possibility. Arguments among modern historians connected with Harvard University continue regarding whether medieval reports about giant discoveries reflect deliberate fabrication, sincere misunderstanding, symbolic storytelling, or combinations of all three. The surviving accounts vary enormously in tone and detail. Some writers sound cautious, others sound breathlessly convinced. For a moment, cool sea wind carries the scent of salt and storm rain across crowded harbour walls, while sailors load barrels onto ships preparing for uncertain voyages. One captain quietly describes discovering enormous footprints along a remote northern shore years earlier. Nobody laughs openly. Certain stories refuse easy dismissal. You notice how medieval audiences approach giant legends less as isolated myths and more as possible extensions of sacred history still shaping the present world. Ancient beings belong to the same timeline as ordinary humanity. The past remained physically close through ruins, relics, bones, and inherited scripture. Mysteries surrounded daily life, In your ears, firewood crackles softly, while travellers settle beneath heavy blankets inside crowded inns after another difficult day on the dangerous roads. Outside rain drifts through darkness beyond shuttered windows. Somewhere far away, another wandering pilgrim uncovers strange ruins or enormous bones destined to become tomorrow's whispered legend. And through every retelling, the children of the Watchers continue walking beside humanity across the long, restless night of history. The centuries turn again beneath widening horizons and restless curiosity. Medieval certainties begin loosening their grip as scholars, artists, and explorers go on search eagerly through the ruins of older civilizations for forgotten knowledge, waiting beneath dust and silence. The Renaissance arrives quietly at first, then all at once. You walk through crowded Italian streets where workshops glow late into the evening and printing presses rattle endlessly beneath open windows. The air smells of ink candle smoke, damp stone, and fresh paint drying across unfinished canvases. Ideas spread faster now. For a moment, it feels as though you stand inside a scholar's private study lined with ancient manuscripts gathered from monasteries, markets, and collapsing libraries across Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. Maps cover wooden tables beside fossil fragments, old coins and carefully copied texts discussing floods, heavenly beings, and giant races from distant antiquity. Curiosity has become fashionable. Renaissance thinkers inherit centuries of giant traditions, yet they approach them differently than many earlier generations. Rather than accepting inherited explanations automatically, scholars begin comparing sources, critically studying languages carefully, and examining physical evidence with growing skepticism. The questions become sharper. Records examined by historians connected with Yale University note that Renaissance humanism encouraged renewed investigation into ancient texts through direct study, rather than unquestioned reliance upon medieval interpretation. Scholars increasingly sought original meanings hidden beneath centuries of commentary and tradition. The Nephilim stories therefore entered a new intellectual environment. You continue through bustling universities where students debate philosophy, astronomy, anatomy, and theology beneath vaulted lecture halls. Some professors still defend literal giant traditions passionately. Others suggest ancient writers exaggerated symbolic truths into physical descriptions over time. Arguments multiply quickly once curiosity gains momentum. A curious footnote preserved within several Renaissance collections describes wealthy nobles purchasing enormous bones and strange artifacts for private cabinets of curiosity. These rooms displayed natural wonders beside ancient relics, blurring boundaries between science, myth, and spectacle. People still wanted evidence they could touch. In your ears, printing presses thump rhythmically, while apprentices carry fresh pages smelling sharply of wet ink through narrow workshops. Books discussing ancient history now circulate farther and faster than ever before. Giant legends, once confined to isolated manuscripts, become widely available to educated audiences across Europe. Ideas no longer travel slowly. Research discussed by scholars associated with Oxford University highlights how the Renaissance transformed relationships between authority and evidence. Observation, comparison, and textual analysis gradually challenged older habits, relying primarily upon inherited tradition. Yet the process remained uneven and incomplete. Many educated people still believe giants once existed literally. One scandalous aside circulating among Renaissance intellectuals claims certain church authorities worried excessive curiosity about ancient mysteries might encourage dangerous questioning beyond giant legends alone. Investigating one uncertainty often leads toward others. Knowledge expands unpredictably. You walk through excavation sites where laborers uncover buried statues and ruined temples beneath growing cities. Massive stone figures emerging from the earth strengthen fascination with lost civilizations populated by seemingly larger-than-life ancestors. Scale continues affecting imagination profoundly. A mainstream historical observation discussed within research connected with Harvard University notes that Renaissance encounters with classical ruins inspired widespread belief that earlier ages possessed greater strength, wisdom, and grandeur than the present world. Giant traditions fit naturally within this nostalgic framework. The past appeared monumental. Your mind drifts toward anatomists and natural philosophers, examining enormous bones more carefully than previous generations. Some begin suspecting many discoveries belong not to human giants but to extinct animals unknown in living memory. Others resist abandoning traditional explanations entirely. The old certainty starts cracking slowly. Oddly enough, Renaissance artists also reshape giant imagery through painting, sculpture, and literature. Giants become dramatic symbols representing chaos, ambition, heroic struggle, or humanity confronting overwhelming forces beyond ordinary scale. Art keeps myths emotionally alive even as scholarship grows skeptical. Arguments among modern historians connected with Stanford University continue regarding whether Renaissance inquiry weakened belief in giant traditions overall, or merely transformed how educated audiences interpreted them. The answer appears complicated. Skepticism increased gradually, yet fascination remained powerful. For a moment, warm candlelight flickers across shelves crowded with translated manuscripts while rain taps gently against lead glass windows. A scholar pauses over conflicting accounts describing ancient giants before the flood. He compares sources, carefully searching for historical truth beneath layers of myth and commentary. The desire to understand becomes almost sacred. You notice how Renaissance thinkers rarely dismiss giant traditions casually. Even doubters approach the subject seriously because the stories remain deeply woven into religious history, classical literature, and popular imagination simultaneously. Abandoning them entirely feels difficult. In your ears, distant church bells mingle with laughter, drifting from crowded taverns where travellers continue sharing rumours about enormous skeletons discovered in caves and riverbanks across Europe. Ordinary people remain less interested in scholarly caution than thrilling possibility. Mystery survives intellectual change surprisingly well. Night settles across the Renaissance cities now. Moonlight reflects softly from tiled rooftops while printers continue working beneath smoky lamps deep into the evening. Somewhere inside a cluttered study, another scholar copies notes about giants' floods and heavenly rebellion into a growing collection of human knowledge. And with every careful question asked, the old legends prepare themselves for another transformation. The printing presses continue thundering across Europe while the world changes faster than earlier generations could have imagined. Ships cross oceans previously marked only by rumour, New continents enter old maps, telescopes reveal unexpected heavens above humanity, and slowly science begins challenging the giants directly. You walk through crowded museums and private collections where scholars examine fossils beneath bright window light instead of candlelit superstition. Cabinets overflow with bones, shells, preserved creatures, and strange stones gathered from every corner of the expanding world. Curiosity has become systematic now. For a moment, it feels as though you stand inside an early natural history hall, where researchers in heavy coats lean over enormous fossil remains spread across wooden tables. The room smells of dust ink drying specimens and damp wool carried in from winter streets outside. The bones no longer speak with one voice. Earlier centuries often interpreted massive remains through mythological frameworks automatically. Now anatomists compare skeletons carefully. Geologists study rock layers surrounding discoveries. Natural philosophers attempt reconstructing extinct animals from fragmented evidence. The Earth itself becomes a historical archive. Records examined by historians connected with the University of Chicago note that the scientific revolution gradually transformed how European societies interpreted natural anomalies. Fossils increasingly shifted from proof supporting legendary giants toward evidence for extinct species and ancient geological processes. The emotional transition proved surprisingly slow. You continue through lecture halls where professors display enormous teeth and fossilized bones before fascinated audiences. Some listeners embrace scientific explanations eagerly. Others remain unconvinced, insisting ancient texts describing giants cannot simply be dismissed. Old beliefs rarely vanish quietly. A curious footnote preserved within several 18th century accounts describes heated public arguments erupting after certain fossil discoveries received scientific reinterpretation. Communities accustomed to viewing giant bones as sacred evidence sometimes resisted alternative explanation strongly. Identity attaches itself 2 stories deep. In your ears, quills scratch rapidly, while scholars sketch fossil specimens beside detailed notes concerning anatomy and comparative structure. The language surrounding giant discoveries changes noticeably. Terms like extinct species, prehistoric creatures, and geological ages slowly replace earlier assumptions about ancient human races. A new worldview emerges piece by piece. Research discussed by scholars associated with Harvard University highlights how paleontology developed partly through attempts to explain mysterious oversized remains long associated with mythological giants. Scientific investigation did not appear separate from older traditions immediately. Instead, it evolved gradually from them. The myths unintentionally helped inspire science itself. One scandalous aside circulating among certain intellectual circles claimed some collectors deliberately mislabeled fossils as giant remains to attract public attention and wealthy patrons. Spectacle remained profitable even during the rise of scientific skepticism. Human fascination still sells well. You walk beside excavation teams working carefully through exposed cliff faces, where ancient bones emerge from hardened earth untouched for unimaginable lengths of time. The scale feels humbling. Entire creatures once larger than any living animal now appear through patient labour and growing scientific understanding. The earth becomes stranger than mythology. A mainstream historical observation discussed within research connected with Stanford University notes that 19th century geology and evolutionary science radically expanded humanity's sense of time. Ancient giant legends, once linked to sacred history, now competed against evidence suggesting the world itself was vastly older than previously believed. The timeline stretched beyond comprehension. Your mind drifts toward crowded public exhibitions where enormous dinosaur skeletons tower above astonished visitors beneath high museum ceilings. Children stare upward with open mouths while adults whisper uneasily about creatures once dominating the earth long before human civilization existed. Reality remains capable of inspiring awe. Oddly enough, scientific discoveries did not eliminate giant fascination entirely. Instead, they transformed it. Ancient myths about enormous beings suddenly existed beside real evidence of prehistoric monsters, extinct mammals, and forgotten worlds buried beneath ordinary landscapes. The imagination adapted immediately. Arguments among modern historians connected with Princeton University continue regarding whether scientific progress weakened supernatural interpretations universally or simply divided audiences into competing camps regarding ancient mysteries and sacred traditions. The debates remain surprisingly alive even now. For a moment, rain strikes museum windows softly, while gas lamps flicker across polished fossil displays. A lecturer explains how mammoth skeletons, once mistaken for giant humans, actually belong to extinct animals roaming prehistoric Ice Age landscapes. Some listeners nod thoughtfully, others remain unconvinced. You notice how deeply emotional the giant traditions remain despite growing scientific explanations. The Nephilim stories address more than physical size alone. They explore fears surrounding forbidden knowledge, moral corruption, lost civilizations, and humanity confronting forces larger than itself. Science answers certain questions elegantly, yet emotional mysteries endure. In your ears, train whistles echo through industrial cities expanding beneath smoke-filled skies. Modernity arrives with astonishing speed. Machines reshape labor. Electricity transforms night. Scientific confidence grows stronger with every decade. Still somewhere beyond urban centers, people continue discovering strange bones after storms expose ancient Earth. And each discovery briefly awakens the old whisper again. What if the giants were real after all? Night settles softly across museum halls now. Fossil skeletons cast enormous shadows beneath dimmed lamps while researchers lock away specimens for another evening. Outside modern cities hum with restless energy, unimaginable to earlier centuries. Yet beneath all that progress, humanity still carries ancient memories of towering figures walking beneath troubled heavens before the flood. Some stories never disappear completely. They simply learn new languages. Modern cities glow through the night now, their streets alive with engines, electric signs, and distant sirens echoing between glass towers. Yet even surrounded by technology and scientific certainty, humanity still digs constantly into ancient Earth searching for forgotten origins. And occasionally the giants rise again. You walk beside archaeologists working carefully beneath harsh desert sunlight, while brushes sweep dust from buried stones older than memory itself. Nearby generators hum softly beside excavation tents filled with maps, notebooks, and fragments waiting for interpretation. The past feels astonishingly close here. For a moment, it feels as though you kneel beside a freshly uncovered burial site where researchers examine human remains with practiced concentration. The air smells of dry earth, canvas, sunscreen, and coffee gone cold hours earlier. Every bone invites question. Modern archaeology approaches ancient giant traditions differently than earlier generations. Instead of beginning with legend, researchers analyze material evidence systematically. Measurements, dating techniques, environmental conditions, cultural context. Scientific caution shapes interpretation at every stage. Yet the old stories remain impossible to ignore entirely. Records examined by historians connected with Columbia University note that archaeology often encounters public fascination surrounding giant myths whenever unusually large skeletons or monumental ruins appear in news reports. Popular imagination still gravitates instinctively toward ancient legends explaining mysterious discoveries. The Nephilim continue haunting interpretation itself. You continue through excavation trenches where pottery shards, tools, and collapsed walls emerge gradually from buried civilizations lost for thousands of years. Archaeologists reconstruct daily life patiently from tiny fragments rather than dramatic myths alone. Reality reveals itself slowly. A curious footnote discussed within modern academic circles involves recurring internet hoaxes claiming archaeologists uncovered giant skeletons hidden from public knowledge. Manipulated photographs spread rapidly despite repeated debunking by experts. People desperately want the stories confirmed. Research discussed by scholars associated with Yale University highlights how giant myths persist partly because they satisfy emotional desires for mystery, cosmic drama, and hidden history absent from ordinary modern life. Legends involving the Watchers and Nephilim offer narratives grander than routine existence. The psychological appeal remains powerful. In your ears, excavation tools scrape gently against compacted soil, while researchers debate interpretations beside open trenches. One specialist studies ancient nutrition, another examines burial customs, a third reconstructs climate conditions shaping forgotten civilizations. Modern scholarship fragments knowledge into specialties, yet ancient myths resist fragmentation. One scandalous aside circulating within conspiracy communities claims governments and universities deliberately conceal evidence supporting giant races to protect accepted historical narratives. Professional archaeologists repeatedly reject such claims, yet suspicion persists stubbornly online and in popular culture. Mystery thrives wherever trust weakens. A mainstream historical observation discussed within research connected with Harvard University notes that many monumental ancient structures once attributed to giants or supernatural builders are now understood through careful study of engineering, labor, organization, and social hierarchy. Human civilizations proved remarkably capable without mythical assistance. Still, emotional fascination with lost greatness endures. Your mind drifts toward museums where visitors stand silently before enormous stone monuments transported from ancient kingdoms into polished galleries. Massive statues tower overhead beneath cool artificial lighting. Even with scientific explanations available, the scale still feels overwhelming. Human beings remain emotionally vulnerable to grandeur. Oddly enough, modern archaeology sometimes strengthens appreciation for giant myths indirectly. The more researchers uncover about ancient civilizations, the clearer it becomes that earlier societies possessed astonishing complexity, ambition, and organizational skill. Reality already borders on unbelievable. Arguments among modern historians connected with Stanford University continue regarding how ancient myths should be interpreted within broader cultural history. Some scholars emphasize symbolic meaning entirely. Others remain interested in possible historical memories embedded beneath exaggeration and supernatural language. The debate has grown more sophisticated, not disappeared. For a moment, warm desert wind moves across excavation tents while sunset paints surrounding ruins gold and crimson. Researchers pack delicate artifacts carefully into protective cases before darkness arrives. Nearby local workers share inherited legends connected with the site despite modern scientific activity surrounding them. Old stories survive beside new methods comfortably. You notice how archaeology rarely destroys myth completely. Instead, it changes the relationship people have with ancient stories. The Nephilim traditions become windows into how earlier civilizations understood fear, power, catastrophe, and forbidden knowledge. The myths reveal emotional history. In your ears, laptop keyboards click softly inside temporary field laboratories while satellite equipment hums outside beneath widening stars. Modern technology studies landscapes ancient storytellers once crossed by foot beneath the same heavens. Thousands of years separate them, yet certain questions remain remarkably familiar. Why do civilizations collapse? What happens when knowledge outpaces wisdom? Why do human beings repeatedly imagine giants standing behind lost ages and ruined worlds? Night settles gently across the archaeological camp now. Beyond the electric lanterns, the desert returns to deep silence, broken only by distant wind moving across buried stones beneath the darkness. Somewhere under that ancient earth lie countless forgotten lives waiting patiently for rediscovery. And somewhere within human imagination, the children of the Watchers continue rising whenever mystery touches the edges of history once more. The modern world never truly sleeps anymore. Screens glow through midnight windows, phones vibrate softly beside beds. Stories travel across continents in seconds instead of centuries. Yet among all this technology and endless information, ancient mysteries still find eager audiences waiting in the dark, especially the giants. You drift through the strange landscape of modern popular culture where old legends return wearing new disguises. Documentary specials whisper dramatic theories beneath ominous music. Novelists imagine hidden bloodlines descending from the Nephilim. Internet forums overflow with blurry photographs, conspiracy threads, and endless speculation. The Watchers have entered the digital age. For a moment, it feels as though you sit alone late at night while glowing screens illuminate a quiet room. Rain taps gently against the window. Somewhere online, another video promises secret evidence proving giants once ruled the earth before the flood destroyed their kingdoms. Curiosity pulls people closer immediately. Modern fascination with the Nephilim blends ancient fears with contemporary anxieties beautifully. Earlier generations worried about forbidden heavenly knowledge. Modern audiences worry about hidden institutions, secret discoveries, and truths supposedly concealed from ordinary society. The emotional structure barely changes. Records examined by historians connected with Princeton University note that conspiracy theories often thrive during periods of rapid technological and social transformation. Complex modern systems create feelings of uncertainty and powerlessness. Ancient giant legends provide emotionally satisfying narratives, offering hidden explanations beneath chaotic reality. Mystery restores meaning. You continue through bookstores crowded with supernatural thrillers, fantasy epics, and speculative histories reimagining the Watchers as extraterrestrials, interdimensional beings, or forgotten advanced civilizations. Every generation reshapes the legends according to its own fears and fascinations. Science fiction becomes modern mythology. A curious footnote discussed within contemporary media studies involves how visual storytelling transformed giant traditions dramatically during the 20th century. Films, television, comics, and video games gave audiences vivid images of towering beings once limited mainly to imagination and text. Pictures intensify emotional belief quickly. In your ears, documentary narrators speak in calm, dramatic tones, while ancient ruins appear across glowing screens beneath stormy music. Aerial footage sweeps above massive stone structures. Digital recreations depict giants striding through flooded landscapes before civilization collapsed. The atmosphere matters almost more than evidence. Research discussed by scholars associated with the University of Chicago highlights how modern entertainment frequently blends factual archaeology, religious tradition, and speculative fiction together in ways audiences may not fully separate emotionally. Stories feel persuasive when presented with confidence and cinematic imagery. The Nephilim thrive perfectly within that environment. One scandalous aside spreading repeatedly across online communities claims giant skeleton discoveries are hidden deliberately by museums and governments worldwide. Despite overwhelming lack of credible evidence, such narratives persist because secrecy itself creates emotional excitement. Forbidden truth remains deeply seductive. A mainstream historical observation discussed within research, connected with Harvard University, notes that mythological themes involving hybrid beings, fallen powers, and catastrophic floods appear repeatedly in modern entertainment because they address enduring psychological concerns surrounding identity, morality, and humanity's relationship with technology and power. The old anxieties simply evolve alongside culture. Your mind drifts toward crowded convention halls where fans discuss ancient mysteries beside displays featuring fantasy art, supernatural fiction, and speculative history books. Some attendees approach the Nephilim symbolically. Others believe literal giant bloodlines survive secretly into modern times. Belief exists across a wide spectrum now. Oddly enough, the internet transformed giant legends into collaborative storytelling spaces, where thousands of strangers build theories together constantly. Ancient oral traditions once spread through campfires and marketplaces. Modern versions spread through comment sections, podcasts, and late-night videos, watched beneath glowing screens. Human behavior changes less than technology does. Arguments among modern historians connected with Stanford University continue regarding whether popular fascination with ancient giants reflects declining trust in traditional institutions, increasing spiritual hunger within secular societies, or simple entertainment driven by mystery and spectacle. Probably all three contribute. For a moment, city lights shimmer beyond rain-covered windows, while someone somewhere falls asleep listening to stories about the Watchers descending upon lonely mountains before the flood reshaped the earth. Ancient narratives once whispered beside fires now travel through headphones across crowded urban apartments. The delivery changes. The emotional experience remains familiar. You notice how modern retellings often emphasize hidden knowledge more strongly than older versions. Secret archives, buried discoveries, suppressed evidence. The giants become symbols for truths ordinary people suspect powerful institutions conceal from them. The Watchers still represent forbidden revelation. In your ears, keyboards click softly while online debates continue deep into the night. Some participants cite archaeology. Others quote ancient scripture or folklore. A few simply enjoy the atmosphere of wonder surrounding mysteries science cannot fully romanticize away. Because even within modern rational societies, people still hunger for enchantment. Night deepens across the connected world now. Satellites cross silent skies once watched by ancient shepherds fearing heavenly visitors descending through darkness. The stars remain unchanged despite all human progress beneath them. And somewhere between myth, memory entertainment, and belief, the children of the Watchers continue walking through modern imagination exactly as they once walked through ancient dreams. Night stretches peacefully across the modern world now. Cities glow softly beneath drifting clouds, while distant highways hum like quiet rivers of light. Somewhere a train passes through sleeping countryside. Somewhere else rain taps gently against apartment windows while tired people settle beneath blankets, carrying private thoughts into darkness. And still, after thousands of years, the giants remain with us. You rest beside the long river of human memory tonight, watching ancient stories drift past like reflections beneath moonlight. The Watchers descending from lonely mountains, the towering children born beneath troubled heavens, the flood swallowing violent kingdoms, survivors carrying fearful memories into newborn civilizations. The legends endured everything. Empires rose and vanished, religions transformed, science redrew humanity's understanding of the universe itself. Yet the Nephilim survived inside whispers, manuscripts, ruins, paintings, museums, films, and restless late-night curiosity. That persistence matters. For a moment, it feels as though you stand upon a quiet hillside beneath cold stars exactly like the shepherds from the earlier stories. Wind moves softly through tall grass, while distant valleys disappear into darkness beyond sight. The sky still feels enormous. Perhaps that is where the giants truly live now. Not buried beneath mountains waiting for rediscovery, but inside the emotional space created whenever human beings confront mystery larger than themselves. The legends speak to permanent anxieties. Records examined by historians connected with Yale University note that myths survive across centuries not because people necessarily believe them literally, but because they continue expressing emotional truths relevant to changing societies. Stories adapt because human fears and desires remain surprisingly consistent beneath cultural change. The Nephilim represent many things simultaneously: forbidden knowledge, corrupted power, lost greatness, fear of moral collapse, anxiety surrounding technological advancement, fascination with hidden origins, humanity confronting forces beyond control. The giants become mirrors. You continue reflecting quietly while cool night air carries the scent of rain-soaked earth and distant cedar smoke. Somewhere beyond visible horizons, archaeologists still uncover forgotten ruins beneath desert sands. Scientists continue studying ancient bones and shifting landscapes. Historians debate interpretation endlessly through universities and books. Questions survive every answer. A curious footnote discussed within modern anthropology suggests giant myths may also reflect deep human awareness of vulnerability itself. Against storms, mountains, oceans, and time, humanity has always felt physically small despite enormous ambition. Perhaps imagining giants helped people externalize overwhelming forces emotionally. In your ears, the distant echo of earlier centuries returns briefly. Monks copying candle-lit manuscripts, travellers whispering beside campfires, philosophers debating beneath marble columns, children staring wide-eyed at enormous bones emerging from riverbanks after storms. The chain of storytelling never truly broke. Research discussed by scholars associated with Harvard University highlights how collective myths function as cultural memory systems, preserving emotional experiences long after historical circumstances change completely. Flood stories preserve fear of catastrophe. Giant legends preserve awe toward overwhelming power and unexplained discovery. The emotional memory outlives literal belief. One scandalous aside lingering through modern discussions still asks whether ancient giant traditions preserve fragments of forgotten historical realities beneath layers of exaggeration and symbolism. Most scholars remain skeptical regarding literal supernatural interpretations, yet complete certainty remains elusive enough for imagination to survive. You notice how the Nephilim legends repeatedly emerge during moments when societies feel unstable or overwhelmed. Ancient civilizations facing collapse, medieval travelers confronting unknown worlds, modern audiences navigating technological acceleration and institutional distrust. The stories awaken when humanity feels uncertain. Oddly enough, the giants rarely symbolize evil alone. There remains sadness attached to them. They belong to a lost world destroyed by violence, pride, and broken boundaries. Their memory carries tragedy as much as terror. Something magnificent vanished with them. Arguments among modern historians connected with Oxford University continue regarding why giant myths appear so consistently across unrelated cultures throughout history. Some researchers emphasize psychological archetypes rooted deeply within human cognition. Others focus upon environmental factors, fossil discoveries, and cultural exchange. No single explanation satisfies completely. Perhaps that incompleteness keeps the legends alive. For a moment, clouds drift aside overhead, revealing stars burning clearly above the sleeping earth. Ancient shepherds watched these same constellations while imagining heavenly beings descending through darkness toward fragile human settlements below. Modern people still gaze upward, searching for meaning too. In your ears, the world grows quieter now. The noise of cities softens into distant murmurs. Screens dim, conversations fade. Only the slow rhythm of night remains, carrying stories older than recorded history gently through the darkness. You breathe deeply. The giants may never have existed literally as ancient storytellers imagined them. Or perhaps fragments of misunderstood truth still hide beneath thousands of years of retelling and reinterpretation. Either way, the Nephilim endure because they express something timeless about humanity itself. Wonder, fear, curiosity, the uneasy feeling that civilization rests upon fragile ground beneath vast mysterious heavens. And so the watchers continue descending each time imagination reaches toward forbidden questions beneath lonely midnight skies. The giants continue walking whenever ancient ruins emerge from earth or enormous shadows move through collective memory once more. And somewhere inside the endless human story, their footsteps still echo softly through the dark. Before you drift fully into sleep tonight, I would love to hear which part of this ancient journey stayed with you the longest. Was it the lonely watchers descending through storm clouds above forgotten mountains? The giant children haunting frightened villages before the flood? Or perhaps the quiet monks preserving dangerous stories beside candlelight while winter winds moved beyond stone walls? Leave a comment sharing the moment that captured your imagination most deeply. And while you're there, tell everyone your local time and where in the world you listened from tonight. There is something strangely comforting about knowing these ancient stories travel across modern nights, connecting listeners beneath the same stars that once inspired the first whispers about the Nephilim. If this journey through forgotten history helped you relax, reflect, or simply escape the noise of the modern world for a little while, remember to like the video and subscribe for more peaceful historical storytelling. There are many more ancient mysteries waiting ahead together. You may also enjoy the next story on the channel, where we wander into another lost world filled with vanished kingdoms, sacred rituals and strange legends carried across centuries by frightened travellers and patient scribes. Until then, let the storms quiet. Let the old ruins rest beneath moonlight. Let the watchers fade gently back into the heavens while the earth grows calm once more beneath sleeping skies. Blessings to you and your family.